Vernon Slade rode up to the fence line at dawn, with 4 armed men behind him and a burning torch in his hand. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He pressed the torch against the corner post of Silas Calder's hay barn and watched the dry wood catch. That's what happens, Slade said, loud enough for the hands sleeping in the bunkhouse to hear, when a man forgets who owns this valley. He turned his horse and rode away while the flames climbed. If you've never seen a man destroy something beautiful just to remind another man that you're about to. This is a story about a cowboy who opened his door to 2 strangers, a dying woman and her desperate daughter, and how that one act of ordinary decency brought him love, enemies, and a fight that would decide who this valley truly belonged to. If stories like this move something in you, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every minute of this one counts. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, the kind of cold October rain that didn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It just arrived, steady and indifferent, soaking into the ground until the creek beds swelled and the wagon roads turned to mud that grabbed at wheels and wouldn't let go. Silas Calder had been riding the south fence since 3 o'clock, checking for breaks after 2 steers had wandered off the day before. He found them eventually, standing knee-deep in the shallow end of Blackstone Creek, looking annoyed about the weather in the way cattle sometimes did, as if they'd expected something better from Wyoming. He pushed them back through a soft spot in the fence line, wired the gap shut with what he had in his bag, and turned north toward home. He almost didn't see the wagon. It was off the road by maybe 15 feet, tilted hard to the left where the rear wheel had dropped into a drainage channel hidden by the grass. The canvas cover had partially collapsed on one side. One of the horses was still in the traces, standing with its head low and its ears flattened against the rain. The other was gone, the harness broken and dragging in the mud, which meant it had been struggling long enough for something to snap. Silas pulled up and sat in the saddle for a moment. He'd learned to be careful about stopped wagons after dark. Not everything helpless was innocent. But then he heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, tight and afraid, coming from inside the collapsed canvas. Not screaming. Worse than screaming, the kind of voice that had already screamed itself out and was now just trying to hold itself together. Please, she was saying. Please, just breathe. Just keep breathing. I'm here. I'm right here. He got down. He tied his horse to the wagon wheel and pushed back the edge of the canvas. The smell hit him first, fever sweat, the particular sharp, sore smell of a body burning from the inside. Inside the tilted wagon bed, a young woman was kneeling on a wool blanket beside an older woman who was laid out flat, her gray hair plastered to her face with sweat, her chest moving in shallow, uneven pulls. The young woman looked up at Silas with eyes that had gone past fear into something flatter and harder. Can't get up, she said. She's been like this since this morning. I need to get her somewhere warm. Silas looked at the older woman. Her lips had the faint blue tinge that came with a fever that had been running too long. Her breathing had a wet catch to it that he didn't like. How long has she had the fever? 2 days. The young woman's jaw tightened. Maybe 3. It came on fast. She your mother?
Yes.
He looked at the broken harness, the tilted wheel, the rain coming down, without any sign of stopping. Where were you headed? Millhaven. We have a cousin there. We left Cheyenne 8 days ago. She stopped. Her voice had started to shake, and she was fighting it. The road was supposed to be passable. The man at the last post station said it was passable. Silas didn't say anything about the road. He thought about his ranch, 4 miles north. He thought about the bunkhouse where his 2 hired hands, Clem and Roy, were probably eating supper. He thought about the spare room off the kitchen that had been empty since his hired girl left in the spring. I'm going to lift her, he said. Tell me if she says anything hurts. The young woman blinked. Where are you taking her? My place. 4 miles. It's the closest we can pay. We have some money. I want to be clear that I'm not asking for money. Can you ride? She looked at his horse tied to the wheel. She looked at her mother. Yes. Good. He handed her his oilskin. Put this on. You're soaked through. She took it without arguing. That told him something about her. She was practical enough to put aside pride when the situation required it. That was not a quality everyone had. Getting the older woman out of the wagon took longer than it should have. The tilt of the wagon bed made every movement awkward, and the woman was heavier than she looked, the dead weight of fever unconsciousness. She stirred once when Silas got his arms under her, opened her eyes briefly, and said, "Thomas," in a confused voice. "Not Thomas," Silas said. "Just a neighbor. You're going to be all right." She closed her eyes again. He carried her out into the rain and stood there for a moment with her in his arms, making the calculation. His horse was steady enough, but he couldn't ride and hold an unconscious woman safely, not in this dark on a muddy road. "Can you lead him?" he asked the daughter. "Steady walk, nothing faster." "Yes. What's your name?" She was already moving to take the reins. "Adeline. Adeline Bellamy. My mother is Margaret." Silas Calder. He adjusted his grip on Margaret and nodded toward the road. "Let's go." They walked the 4 miles in the rain without much talking. Adeline kept the horse steady, which he noticed. She didn't crowd the animal, didn't jerk the reins, didn't panic when the horse shied at something in the dark. She just kept walking, her hand firm and low on the lead, the borrowed oilskin hanging to her knees and doing almost nothing against the cold, since she'd gotten so wet before putting it on. Silas watched her from behind whenever the road was straight enough. She was probably mid-20s, maybe close to 30. Dark hair, dark eyes he'd only glimpsed briefly in the wagon's low light. Her dress was practical, not pretty, the kind of dress a woman wore when she expected to be doing hard work. Boots were good leather, well made, but they'd seen serious use. He wondered about Thomas, the name Margaret had said. He figured he'd find out eventually. Clem was on the porch when they came up the track, smoking his evening pipe and watching the rain. He stood up fast when he saw Silas carrying someone. "Get the spare room open," Silas said. "Clean blankets. And get the stove going in there." Clem went without asking questions. That was one of the things Silas valued about Clem. He got Margaret inside and onto the bed. She was burning. When he laid her down, he could feel the heat through her dress. Adeline came in from tying the horse and stood in the doorway of the small room, dripping on the floor, looking at her mother with an expression that Silas recognized. He'd seen it on his own face once years ago, in a different room. "Has she had water?" "Some. She keeps refusing it." "You have to make her take it anyway." He went to the kitchen and came back with a cup of water and a small cloth. He showed Adeline how to wet the cloth and press it to her mother's lips, how to lift her head enough that she'd swallow when the moisture touched her throat. Adeline watched carefully and then did it herself. She had good hands, steady and patient. "The fever might get worse tonight before it gets better," Silas said. "I want to warn you, I know." She looked up at him. "This isn't the first time she's been sick. She had something similar 2 winters ago. She came through it." "Good. That's good to know." He moved toward the door. "I'll have Clem bring you food. You should eat." "I'm not." "You're no good to her if you collapse." He said it flat, not unkind. Just true. "Eat something." She looked like she wanted to argue and then didn't. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded and left. He sat up in the kitchen until past midnight, which wasn't something he'd planned. He told himself he was waiting to see if the fever broke. He told himself he needed to be available if Margaret's condition changed and Adeline needed help. He poured himself a cup of coffee that went cold while he wasn't paying attention to it, and listened to the rain on the roof and the occasional sound from the back bedroom, the murmur of Adeline's voice, low and continuous, talking to her mother the way you talk to someone when you needed them to know you were still there. Around 1 in the morning, he heard footsteps in the hall. Adeline appeared in the kitchen doorway still, in the same wet dress, her hair coming loose from its pin. "She's asking for water herself," she said. "I think the fever might be easing a little." "That's good." She leaned against the doorframe and closed her eyes for a moment, and he could see in that second how tired she actually was. Not just the tired of one long night, but the tired of days of fear, the kind that settled into your bones and didn't let go. "Sit down," he said. She opened her eyes. "I need to get back to her. She's asking for water. That means she's stable for a minute. Sit down." She sat at the table. He put a plate cold biscuits and leftover beef in front of her, and she ate without commenting on the temperature. He'd been right about her being practical. "Your husband," he said. "Is he coming behind you?" She looked up from the plate. "I don't have a husband." "Your father, then." "Thomas." Something crossed her face. My father died 4 years ago. Thomas was his name. She ate another bite. It was just the two of us when we left Cheyenne. My mother thought we could make it to Millhaven before the weather turned. The weather turned early this year. I noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 2 women traveling alone from Cheyenne. Is that a question? I suppose it is. She looked at him directly, and there was something in it, not hostility exactly, but a kind of readiness. Like she'd been asked this question before and had her answer prepared. We don't have much left in Cheyenne worth staying for. Our cousin in Millhaven offered work. Real work. She set her fork down. I know what people think when they see 2 women traveling alone. I know what it looks like. I'm not asking for anyone's opinion about it. Get one, Silas said. She blinked no. You're right, you didn't. She picked up her fork again. Sorry. Nothing to be sorry for. She ate the rest of the food. He refilled her water glass without being asked. Outside, the rain had settled into a lighter pattern, still steady but less aggressive. Inside, the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and wet wool and old coffee. You should sleep, he said when she'd finished. I'll sit with her for a few hours. Adeline stared at him. You don't know her. No, you don't owe us anything. I know that. She kept looking at him, and he could see her trying to find the angle what he wanted, what he expected, what the cost was going to be eventually. He knew that look too. He'd lived long enough to understand what it meant when a person went looking for the price of kindness. I'll be just down the hall if she worsens, he said. You sleep. 4 hours at least. She stood up from the table. Her hands were gripping the edge for a second, longer than necessary, and he understood that her legs were more tired than she'd admitted. She straightened up and let go. 4 hours, she said. Go, she went. He sat with Margaret for 2 hours, changing the cloth on her forehead when it warmed, giving her water when she roused enough to take it. She talked sometimes in her fever names he didn't know. Places, fragments of argument and laughter mixed together the way fever did to memory. Once, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and said, Thomas, don't you dare, very clearly, and then subsided. I won't, Silas said quietly, and meant nothing specific by it, but it seemed to settle her. Margaret's breathing was uneven, not dangerously so, but uneven in a way that reminded him of other breathing he'd heard in other rooms. His mother had died on a Tuesday in March. He'd been 19. The doctor had been sent for 2 days before she passed, but the doctor had another call, and then the roads had gone bad with a late-season ice storm, and by the time help arrived, his mother was already gone. He'd stood in that room for a long time after, long enough that his father had come in and put a hand on his shoulder and said something that Silas had never been able to remember clearly, though he'd tried many times. He didn't talk about his mother. It wasn't the kind of thing he raised in conversation. But he thought about her sometimes on nights like this, when the rain was steady and someone nearby was breathing wrong. He thought about her now, listening to Margaret's uneven chest, and he made sure the cloth was cool and the blankets were tucked and the room was warm enough. By the time Adeline came back 4 hours later, hair still loose and eyes still heavy with sleep, Margaret's fever had come down a degree and her breathing had smoothed slightly. Adeline stood in the doorway and looked at her mother. Then she looked at Silas, still in the chair where she'd left him. You stayed, she said. Said I would. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she looks a little better. She does. Adeline moved past him to check her mother's forehead herself. She was careful about it, tilting her head slightly the way people did when they were reading something they needed to be sure about. Then she let out a breath that she'd probably been holding for 3 days. Go sleep, she said, without looking back at him. You need it too. He did. The next 2 days were more of the same, the fever rising and falling. Adeline barely leaving the room, Silas keeping the house running, and making sure food appeared at regular intervals, whether anyone had asked for it or not. Clem and Roy stayed out of the house mostly, doing their work and asking no questions, which was what he paid them for. On the second evening, Roy came to Silas in the barn with an expression he didn't like. Heard from Denny Walsh today, Roy said. He was coming down from Ridgecrest and stopped to water his horses. He said there's been sickness moving through the wagon camps along the Millhaven Road. 3 families down with fever, 1 man already dead. Silas kept working on the harness he was mending. What kind of sickness? Don't know exactly. Just fever is what he said. Fast and bad. Silas looked at the harness for a moment. The woman inside has it. I know. Roy's voice was careful. I'm not saying anything, boss. I'm just telling you what Denny said. You're saying it might spread. I'm saying other people will say it. Silas set down the harness. He thought about the county road that ran past his gate and the other ranches along it, and the fact that word traveled fast in a valley this size. I'll tell Walsh's wife they're quarantined here, he said. Nobody in. Nobody out for now. I'll send Clem for the doctor first thing tomorrow. Roy nodded. And if people ask about the women, I'll handle that. Roy didn't look completely satisfied, but he nodded again and went back to the bunkhouse. The doctor came on day 3. He was a young man, younger than Silas had expected, recently out of a school in the East and setting up practice in Pine Hollow. His name was Garrett. Dr. Emmett Garrett, and he had the careful, precise manner of a man who was still working out the difference between what he'd read in books and what actually happened to people. He examined Margaret thoroughly and asked Adeline detailed questions about the fever's progression, which she answered with enough accuracy and detail that the doctor raised his eyebrows slightly. You have some medical knowledge, he said. I have a sick mother, Adeline said. I've been paying attention. Dr. Garrett prescribed rest, fluids, and willow bark for the fever. He said the worst had likely passed. He said Margaret's constitution seemed strong. When he was done, he stepped out to speak with Silas privately on the porch. The sickness in the wagon camps, the young doctor said. Has she been in contact with anyone from those camps? Not that I know of. They were traveling through. Could be the same illness. I don't know yet, doctor. Garrett looked uncomfortable in the way of someone who understood risk but didn't want to be the person who said the difficult thing. You understand that keeping them here, I understand. County might, I said I understand. Silas's voice was quiet. She's not going anywhere in her condition. That's not something I'm going to change. County has a problem with it. They can come talk to me. The doctor nodded slowly. The daughter seems capable. She is good. He snapped his bag shut. Willow bark 3 times daily. Send for me if her breathing changes. He left. Silas went back inside. He found Adeline in the kitchen, standing at the window with her arms folded and her back to him. He thinks it might be the sickness from the wagon camps, she said, without turning around. He doesn't know, but he thinks it might be. She turned then, and her face was tight. If she passes it to you or to your men. She won't. You don't know that. She's getting better. The fever's down. He poured coffee. Drink something. She stared at him. Why aren't you angry? About what? About any of this. About us being here. About the risk. He set the cup on the table in front of her. He thought about his mother, about Tuesday in March, about a doctor who arrived 2 days too late on an icy road. He didn't say any of that. Because I'm not, he said. She picked up the cup. On the 4th night, Margaret's fever spiked again. Silas was already up. He'd learned to sleep light these past few days, and he heard Adeline's voice through the wall before he was fully awake, tighter and higher than usual. He was out of his room and down the hall in about 15 seconds. Margaret was talking fast and low, rambling, and her skin was burning again. Her hands were moving against the blankets in the restless way that meant the fever had climbed back into dangerous territory. Get more cold cloths, Silas said. Adeline was already moving. She came back with the cloths. They worked together in the small room without getting in each other's way, which took a certain kind of practiced reading of another person's movement. Later, Silas would think about that how they'd just naturally arranged themselves around the task, without discussion, without collision. Around 2 a.m, Margaret's restlessness peaked and then slowly eased. Her skin began to cool under their hands. Her breathing evened out. Adeline sat back in the chair beside the bed, and the tension that had been holding her body rigid for the past hour went out of her all at once. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. He noticed that. She just sat there with her face covered for about 30 seconds, and then she straightened up and took her hands away and looked at her mother. I keep thinking, she said quietly, about what happens if she dies here. Silas was sitting on the edge of the low stool he'd pulled over to be useful during the past hour. He didn't answer immediately. He let her talk. I have almost nothing, Adeline said. The wagon's broken. The one horse is still here. The money we left Cheyenne with is down to almost nothing, Because we had to pay for 2 nights at a post station when the rain started. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her mother. My cousin in Millhaven doesn't know we never arrived. She might not even be expecting us now it's been too long. I don't know where I would go. You don't have to figure that out tonight, Silas said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I know that. But it's 3 in the morning, and I can't stop thinking about it, and I thought, she stopped. I thought maybe if I said it out loud, it would stop being so loud in my head. Did it work? She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. A little they sat with a quiet for a while. Through the window, the stars were out. The rain had finally passed. Cattle were settled. The night was that deep October still that sometimes came after a storm, cold and clean and very large. She's going to be all right, Silas said finally. He said it because it was true, or because he believed it was true, which was close enough. Adeline looked at him. How do you know? Because she's been fighting for 4 days, and she's still here. He stood up from the stool. Get some sleep. I'll sit for a while. She didn't argue this time. She touched her mother's hand once, briefly, and then she went down the hall to her room, and Silas sat in the chair in the low lamplight and listened to Margaret breathe. He thought about 2 strangers arriving in the rain. He thought about the particular weight of a person who needed to be carried, and the fact that it never felt like a burden when you chose to pick them up yourself. He thought about the way Adeline had said, I have almost nothing without asking him to fix it. He sat with Margaret until the sky outside began to lighten. On the 5th morning, Margaret Bellamy opened her eyes fully for the first time, looked around the unfamiliar room with the careful attention of a woman reassembling reality from its separate pieces, and said in a clear, dry voice, This isn't the post station. Adeline let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. No, Mama, it isn't. Whose room is this? A man named Silas Calder. He found us on the road. He brought us here. Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing. The wagon, the wheel broke. We couldn't move it. Our things? All here. He had Clem bring them in from the wagon the first night. Margaret turned her head slowly and looked at Adeline with the particular expression of a mother taking inventory of her child. And you? Are you all right? I'm fine, Mama. You look thin. You've been sick for 5 days. I've been a little busy. Margaret made a sound that was almost a snort. 5 days. She seemed to be doing arithmetic. And this man Calder, he's been taking care of us. Yes. Margaret was quiet again. Then she said, I want to meet him. You'll have to get strong enough to sit up first. Don't tell me what I have to do, Adeline. Go get him. Silas came in when Adeline found him in the barn. He sat in the chair beside Margaret's bed and looked at her directly. She was thin and washed out from the fever, but her eyes were sharp. Thank you, she said. Glad you're feeling better. I want to know what we owe you. Nothing. Margaret looked at him the way experienced women looked at men who said things that seemed too good. It was a kind of flat, experienced appraisal. Nothing, she repeated. Nothing. A man takes in 2 strangers and nurses one of them through 5 days of fever and wants nothing. That's right. She considered him for a long moment. Then she said, You remind me of Thomas. He didn't ask who Thomas was. He already knew. Get some more rest, he said instead. You've got some weight to put back on. He left her to sleep. In the kitchen, he found Adeline heating broth for her mother. She had her back to him, and he could see the set of her shoulders, how much she was carrying still. She wants to pay you, Adeline said, without turning around. She can want whatever she likes. You're going to make this difficult. I'm not making anything difficult. You can both stay until she's strong enough to travel. That's all there is. Adeline turned from the stove. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something complicated, something that involved gratitude, but wasn't only gratitude. People don't do that, she said. Do what? Just help. Without wanting something. He leaned against the doorframe. What do you think I want? She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know, she finally said. That's what makes me nervous. He understood that. He didn't argue with it. There's bread in the bread box, he said. Put some in the broth. She needs the substance. Adeline looked at the bread box, then looked back at him, then turned back to the stove. She did not say thank you again. She just added the bread. And Silas went back out to work because the cattle didn't care about fever or gratitude or the way a person looked at you across a kitchen when they were trying to figure out whether you were real. By evening, Margaret was sitting up. By the next morning, she was asking for her travel trunk. Adeline brought it to her and watched her mother sort through it with the careful attention of a woman checking that everything she valued had survived. Most of it had, and buried under 3 winter dresses and a bundle of letters, tied with a piece of brown cord, was her late husband's survey leather case, the one that Thomas Bellamy had carried across Wyoming territory for 15 years, marking water rights and boundary lines and all the invisible agreements that held the land together. Margaret ran her thumb along the edge of the case. She didn't say anything about it. She put it back under the dresses. Neither she nor Adeline knew yet what it contained. Neither of them knew that a cattle baron named Vernon Slade had already ridden past Calder's gate 3 times in the past week, slowing his horse each time to look at the smoke rising from the chimneys. Slade had a long memory and a short temper and a piece of paper with Silas Calder's name on it that he'd been waiting to use. The fact that there were strangers at Calder Ranch, now strangers who'd arrived sick and helpless, and given Silas Calder the distraction of playing nursemaid Slade, considered this very convenient timing. He smiled as he rode past the gate on the 4th day. He was a patient man when patience served him. He wouldn't stay patient much longer. Margaret had been sitting up for 3 days before she tried to stand on her own, which was 2 days sooner than anyone thought was wise. Adeline caught her halfway between the bed and the door, one hand gripping the bedpost, the other reaching for air. "Mama, what are you doing? I need to use the outhouse by myself." Margaret's voice had most of its usual edge back, which Silas had learned to take as a reliable health indicator. "I'm not an invalid. You were an invalid 5 days ago." That was 5 days ago. She shook her daughter's hand off her arm. "I'm not going to break." She didn't break. She made it to the door and back under her own power, moving carefully but steadily, and when she got back into bed, she had the satisfied look of a woman who had won an argument with her own body. Silas watched this from the hallway and said nothing. He'd learned quickly that commenting on Margaret Bellamy's decisions was not something she invited or rewarded. The day after that, Margaret appeared at the kitchen table for breakfast. Clem, who was pouring himself a second coffee when she walked in, actually stepped back before catching himself. "Morning," she said, settling into the chair, as if she'd been eating at this table for years. "Morning, ma'am," Clem managed. She looked at the pan on the stove. "Those eggs are going to go rubbery if nobody attends to them." Clem attended to the eggs. Adeline came in a minute later, took one look at her mother sitting upright at the kitchen table, and closed her eyes briefly in the manner of someone adjusting their expectations. "You could have told me you were getting up. You would have hovered. I would have helped." Same thing. Margaret picked up the coffee cup someone had set in front of her and wrapped both hands around it. "Sit down, Adeline. You're making me tired, just watching you." Adeline sat. Silas came in from the barn about 10 minutes later. He stopped at the sight of Margaret at the table, and something shifted on his face, not surprise exactly, more like quiet relief that he wasn't going to make a production of. "You're up," he said. "I've been up," she said. "I've been watching everyone in this house creep around like I was already dead. It was unpleasant. We were being careful. You were being mournful. There's a difference." She set her cup down. "Sit down, Mr. Calder. I want to talk to you properly." He sat across from her. Adeline was quiet beside him, watching her mother the way you watched something you couldn't predict. "You kept my daughter and me alive," Margaret said, direct and unhesitating. "You did it without asking for anything. I want you to know I'm not going to forget that, and I'm not going to pretend it's a small thing." "I appreciate that," Silas said. "I'm not finished." She folded her hands on the table. "I also want you to know that we will not be taking advantage of your generosity beyond what's necessary. Adeline and I will stay until I'm strong enough to travel. Then we'll be out of your way. You're not in my way. We're in your spare room and eating your food, and your hired man has been doing extra work to cover for the distraction. We are very much in your way." Her tone wasn't harsh, it was just precise. "But I appreciate you saying it anyway." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Where will you go?" "When you're strong enough. Millhaven, as we planned your cousin." "Yes." He turned his cup in his hands. "The road to Millhaven runs another 6 days east in good weather. The weather is not going to be good for another 3 weeks at the earliest, and by then the creek crossings get unpredictable." He said it without inflection, just information. "I'm not saying you can't go. I'm saying the road will be hard. Margaret looked at him steadily. Then we'll wait until the weather is better. All right. We'll find ways to be useful in the meantime. All right, he said again. Adeline had been watching this exchange without speaking. Now she said, I can cook. I can manage accounts. I can do whatever needs doing. Silas glanced at her. Roy does the cooking. How is Roy's cooking? He paused. Functional. Then maybe Roy could use some help. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. I'll ask him. Roy, as it turned out, was deeply grateful for assistance with the cooking in the way that men were grateful when they'd been enduring their own efforts for too long and someone finally offered relief. He taught Adeline where everything was on the first morning and then mostly stayed out of her way, which suited them both. Within 4 days, the food coming out of the Calder kitchen was noticeably different. Not fancy Adeline wasn't working with much, just the pantry supplies. Silas kept stocked but organized differently, seasoned with more intention, portioned so that nothing was wasted. Clem mentioned it at supper on the third night and then looked alarmed at himself for saying something. Clem, Silas said, it's a compliment, not a crime. Just noticing, Clem muttered, and ate more of the stew. Margaret, by that same third day, had taken over darning the household socks, which no one had been doing, because neither Clem nor Roy had the patience for it, and Silas had been wearing socks with holes in them since March. She sat by the window in the front room with her mending basket and her sharp eyes and her equally sharp commentary whenever anyone came within conversational range. She told Roy his hat needed blocking. She told Clem he was holding the fence wire wrong and would hurt himself eventually. She told Silas very directly and with no preamble that his account books were a disgrace. Silas stood in the doorway to the front room with the account ledger in his hand, which he'd been about to take to his desk. Excuse me, I saw it on the desk when you left it open. Margaret didn't look up from her mending. Columns are a mess, and you've been carrying errors forward from the previous page. You're probably missing money you don't know you're missing. I manage my own books, I can see that. She bit off a thread. Adeline is better at figures than I am. She did her father's survey accounts for the last 3 years of his work. If you give her those books, she'll sort it out in a day. I didn't ask for anyone to sort my books. Margaret looked up at him then, level and unhurried. No, you didn't. She went back to her mending. I'm just telling you it's a problem you have. He stood there for another moment. Then he took the ledger back to his desk. He gave it to Adeline the next morning. He told himself it made practical sense. He told himself it was efficient. He put the ledger on the kitchen table in front of her without a great deal of ceremony and said, Your mother says you're good with accounts. Adeline looked at the ledger. She looked at him. My mother says a lot of things. She's been right so far. A beat. Then Adeline pulled the ledger toward her. She worked on it for 2 days, spread across the kitchen table during the hours when the meals were done and the kitchen was empty. Silas found himself walking past the kitchen doorway more often than he needed to, which he noticed and didn't examine closely. She found 3 errors on the second day, totaling about $40 he hadn't realized were missing, and she put a folded note in the ledger, marking each one, with a short, precise explanation of where the math had gone wrong. She put the ledger back on his desk without mentioning it. He found the note that evening, read it, and sat with it for a while. He went to the kitchen where she was washing up after supper and said, The $40. She kept her hands in the wash water. The previous calculations weren't carrying the partial amounts forward. It adds up over time. Where'd you learn to do accounts? My father. She handed a plate to the drying rack. Kept detailed field records and financial records both. He said the numbers in a survey and the numbers in a ledger worked the same way you had to be exact because everything downstream depended on it. He was a surveyor. For 20 years, Wyoming territory, mostly. Silas leaned against the counter. Your mother mentioned some of his papers were in the travel trunk. Adeline went still, just briefly before she reached for the next dish. Some. He kept most of his field records. I haven't gone through them completely. She paused. He worked across a lot of this region, actually. Different commissions for the territory. Silas didn't say anything to that. He filed it somewhere. Outside, the October cold had settled hard. The grass in the pasture was frost-stiff by morning, and the creek ran low and clear with cold. He was at the corral 8 days after Margaret had come downstairs when Adeline appeared beside the fence. She didn't announce herself. She just came and stood there with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and watched him work for a while. He was replacing a rotted post, digging the old one out with a spade, which was slow work in frozen ground. "Marry me," she said. He stopped digging. He looked at her. She was looking at the fence, not at him. Her jaw set in the way he'd come to recognize meant she'd made a decision she was going to stand by, regardless of the response. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me." Now she looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but he could see what it was costing her to hold them that way. "I've been thinking about it for several days. I want to say it plainly. Marry me." He set the spade down. He had not been expecting this. He was a man who tried to think ahead, to account for what was coming, and he had not seen this coming. He thought for a moment that he'd misread something, that she'd misread something, that there was a confusion of signals somewhere that he'd caused accidentally. He went back through the past 8 days in his mind, the coffees he'd left outside her door, the ledger, the late hours in the kitchen. He didn't think he'd implied anything he hadn't meant. "Why?" he said. It came out flat. He meant it as a real question. Adeline looked at him like she'd prepared for this too. "Because I have almost no money and nowhere guaranteed to go. Because the road to Millhaven is 6 days in weather that's only going to get worse. Because my cousin may or may not still have work by the time we arrive." She took a breath. "And because you are the first man since my father died who has treated us like people worth something without wanting anything back from it. I don't know what to make of that. But I know it's not common." He picked up the spade. He looked at the rotted post. He looked at her. "No," he said. She blinked. Whatever she'd braced for, it wasn't that. "No," he said again quietly. "Not like this. I wasn't offering something shameful. I know what you thought." He wasn't angry. He wasn't anything she could point at and name. "You thought you needed to solve a problem, and this was the most direct way to solve it. I understand that. And you're right that it would solve some things." He set the spade against the post. But no. Adeline's face had gone carefully still in the way faces went when people were working hard not to show what they felt. "Because you don't want to," she said. He looked at her. "Because I'm not going to let you choose a husband because you're scared. That's not a reason to marry someone. People marry for worse reasons. I'm sure they do." He picked up the spade again. "You and your mother can stay here as long as you need to. That's not conditional on anything. Not on you marrying me, not on anything else." The silence between them was uncomfortable in a way that the other silences hadn't been. "I'm not Charity," Adeline said. Her voice had an edge now. "No, you're not." He kept his voice even. "I know that." "Then why? Because in 5 years or 10, you'd know that the day you asked me was the worst day you'd had in a long time. And I don't want to be the decision you made on your worst day." He looked at her directly. "That's not the way I want it to go." She stared at him. He couldn't read what was in it now, not relief, not hurt, not anger exactly. Something more complicated than any of those. She started. She stopped. She shook her head slightly. "That's a strange answer." "Probably." She turned and walked back toward the house. Halfway there, she stopped without turning around. "We'll be out of your way as soon as my mother is well enough. You'll leave when the road is safe," he said. "Not before." She didn't respond to that. She went inside. He went back to the frozen post and dug. That evening, Margaret came to find him in the barn. She moved carefully still, not at full strength, but purposefully. She sat on an upturned bucket near where he was working on the harness and looked at him with the expression he'd come to understand meant she was going to say something he wasn't going to be able to talk around. "She told you," he said. "She told me you said no." "I did." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "She's humiliated." "I know. That wasn't your intention." "No, it wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. "What was your intention exactly?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I didn't want her to spend the rest of her life knowing she asked because she was desperate." Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Thomas would have liked you." He didn't know what to do with that, so he went back to the harness. "She's not weak," Margaret said. "She's in a hard spot. Those are different things." "I know they are. She doesn't give her trust easily. What she offered you cost her something, whether you realize it or not." "I realize it." He kept his hands on the leather. That's why I said no the way I did. Another long quiet. The horses shifted in their stalls. The barn was warm with their heat and the smell of hay. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Calder," Margaret finally said. "People keep saying things like that this week, because it keeps being true." She stood, more steadily than he expected. "She's going to need time to be angry about it. Don't crowd her." "Planning to." "Good." She headed for the barn door. "Your coffee was cold this morning, by the way. Whatever you're doing to that stove needs adjusting." She left before he could respond, which he suspected was intentional. The next 3 days were careful. Adeline was polite at meals, and in the house polite in the deliberate way of someone choosing their behavior consciously. She was not cold exactly, but she'd put a distance between them that hadn't been there before, and she maintained it with the same precision she brought to the account books. Silas gave her the space. He didn't push. He didn't explain himself again. He left coffee outside her door in the mornings, same as he had before, and he didn't acknowledge it or make anything of it. On the second day, she found it and drank it without comment. On the third day, she put the empty cup back outside the door. He picked it up on his way to the barn and filed that somewhere, too. 2 days after that, Dr. Garrett came back for a follow-up visit. He examined Margaret, declared her recovery essentially complete, and recommended another week of limited activity before she resumed full exertion. He was pulling on his coat on the porch to leave when he said, almost as an aside, "You might want to know there's talk in town." Silas kept his expression neutral. "About?" "About the women staying here." The doctor looked uncomfortable in the familiar way. "People speculate, especially when they don't have all the facts." "What kind of speculation?" "The kind that involves a lonely rancher and a woman who arrived sick and helpless." Garrett paused. "And another kind that the woman might have arranged the whole situation. The sickness, the broken wagon, to find a situation." Silas looked at him. "That's a foul thing to think about someone." "I'm not saying I think it. I'm saying people are saying it." The doctor settled his hat, Mrs. Walsh in particular. "She's been talking at the mercantile." After Garrett left, Silas stood on the porch for a while. He thought about Adeline at the kitchen table with the account books, about her voice in the wagon, "I need to get her somewhere warm," about the way she'd walked 4 miles in the rain leading his horse, without complaint. He thought about the kind of woman who would arrange her mother's near-fatal fever as a scheme. He thought about that for about 3 seconds. Then he went inside. He didn't tell Adeline what Garrett had said. He told himself she had enough to manage without knowing that the town was building stories about her. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to see her face when she heard it. He didn't want to watch her recalibrate what she'd thought this place might be. He managed the information on his own and did nothing with it, which was a decision he'd come to regret. Because 4 days later, Adeline went to the mercantile for the first time. She'd asked if she could take the wagon, his smaller wagon, the one with the repaired wheel, into Pine Hollow for supplies. She had a list. She had some of her own money left. She wanted to contribute. He said yes. He should have gone with her. He didn't think to, which was the regret. She came back 2 hours later, came in through the back door instead of the front, and went straight to her room without speaking to anyone. Margaret, who had been in the kitchen, looked at the closed door and then looked at Silas. "What happened?" Silas asked. "I don't know. Go find out." He knocked on Adeline's door. There was a pause, and then she said, "Come in a voice that was controlled in the effortful way. She was standing at the window with her back to the door. The list she'd taken to town was still in her hand, folded tight. "What happened?" he said. "Mrs. Walsh was at the mercantile," she said. "And 2 other women I didn't know." She stopped. Her shoulders were rigid. "They were talking when I came in. They didn't see me. I heard what they were saying before they noticed I was there." He waited. "They were saying I'd tricked a lonely rancher into keeping me." Her voice was flat and controlled, and that was the most alarming thing about it. "They were saying Mama's sickness was convenient, that we'd targeted you specifically." A pause. "One of them said, I'd probably marry you within the month, and then we'd find a way to take your land." The silence that followed was the kind that needed some time. "Adeline, I'd like you to know," she said, turning around, "that I am not staying another day. My mother is well enough to travel, or she'll be well enough soon enough. I'll find a way to manage the road, the creek crossings. I'll manage them. He looked at her. Her face was set, and he could see what was underneath it, not just anger, but something rawer. The particular wound of being publicly misread in the cruelest direction. They don't know you, he said. I know they don't know me. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she caught it. They'll keep saying it, regardless, and every day I'm here gives them more to say. And she stopped again. You don't need that. You live in this town. You have your reputation, your business. I'm not going to be the reason someone doubts your name. I've never asked you to protect my name. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I've decided. He crossed his arms. You're going to take your mother, who had a near-fatal fever 10 days ago, out on a road with freezing creek crossings in October because Mrs. Walsh said something ignorant in a mercantile. Don't make it sound small. I'm not making it sound small. I'm making it sound like what it is, stupid. Her eyes went sharp. Excuse me? Leaving in these conditions for the sake of what one woman said in a store. That's a stupid decision, and you're smarter than that. She stared at him. He could see her deciding between fury and something else. Don't talk to me like I'm a child, she said. I'm not. I'm talking to you like someone I'd like to not find frozen in a creek bed in November because she couldn't stand being talked about. He met her eyes. You stay, your mother stays. And if Mrs. Walsh has more to say, that's her business. Not mine and not yours. It is my business. It's my reputation. Then build a different one. He said it plainly. You've been here 10 days. Stay long enough for people to actually know what kind of woman you are. Leaving now means they were right, as far as anyone watching is concerned. That landed. He could see it land. She turned back to the window. He waited. I don't understand you, she said, finally quieter. You don't have to. She shook her head. You turned me down. And then you talk to me like I matter to you in some way. You do. She was quiet for a long moment. Why? She asked. Genuinely asking the same way he'd asked her on the corral. He thought about how to answer, honestly. Because you're a decent person in a bad stretch. And those are worth something. She pressed her lips together. He could see the emotion she was managing, the complicated layers of it. All right, she said finally, very quiet. All right. He left her to it. He went out to the barn and leaned against the gate and looked at the October sky going purple at the edges, and he thought about decent people in bad stretches and about what it felt like to want to fight for someone who hadn't asked you to. He'd been alone at this ranch for 6 years. He knew the rhythms of it, the solitude of it, the way silence accumulated in a house that only had one person in it. He'd made a kind of peace with it. He was realizing, standing at the barn gate in the cold, that he didn't particularly want that peace back. He went inside and didn't think about it anymore, because thinking about it wasn't going to change anything that mattered right now. 3 mornings later, Vernon Slade came down the county road and turned through Silas's gate without being invited. Silas saw him from the pasture. He recognized the horse first, a big gray that Slade rode, because it was the largest animal in the valley, and Slade liked to be tall. He finished what he was doing with the fence wire, put his tools away, and walked back to the house at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, because he was not going to trot across his own land, because Vernon Slade had shown up. Slade was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a kind of weathered authority that came from 30 years of being the biggest operation in 100 miles. He had 2 men with him, which he always did, because Vernon Slade did not go anywhere without reminding you that he could hurt you if he chose to. He was on horseback in the yard when Silas came around the corner of the barn. Slade, Silas said. Calder. Slade looked around the yard in the way of someone doing an inventory. His eyes moved to the kitchen window, where there was movement, probably Adeline. His expression didn't change. Heard you've had company. I have travelers. That's right. Slade nodded slowly. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it down toward Silas. Silas took it. He unfolded it and read it once carefully. It was a notice of debt claim. $212 owed under an old water right agreement from 1882, an agreement Silas remembered signing during a drought year when he'd needed temporary access to a secondary channel of Blackstone Creek that Slade's property bordered. He'd thought the matter settled 5 years ago. This was settled, Silas said. It wasn't. Slade's voice was comfortable, pleasant even. I had my man review the accounts recently. There's a balance outstanding. There's no balance outstanding. I paid you in the spring of 1,883. You paid a portion. There was an interest provision in the original agreement. Slade tilted his head. I understand it may have slipped your memory. These things happen. He paused. You have 30 days to produce payment, or the agreement allows me to file a claim on Calder land equivalent to the debt value. Silas looked at the paper. He looked at Slade. You're going to want to be very careful, Silas said, quiet, about what you file and where. Slade smiled. It was a practiced smile, the smile of a man who'd been delivering this particular kind of news for a long time. I'm always careful, Silas. It's one of my better qualities. He pulled his horse around. 30 days. I hope you can get the situation sorted. He and his 2 men rode out the gate. Silas stood in the yard with the paper in his hand. He stood there for a long time. Margaret was on the porch when he turned around. She had a shawl around her shoulders and her mending in her hands, and she'd clearly been there for some portion of the conversation. That man has the eyes of someone who counts everything he sees, she said. He does. The notice. Is it real? Silas looked at the paper again. The agreement was real. The claim that I still owe is not. He folded the paper. Question is whether I can prove that. Can you? He thought about his account books. He thought about Adeline, who had spent 2 days correcting his columns and who had found 3 errors, and who had known her father's survey accounts inside out. I might be able to, he said. He went inside. He found Adeline in the kitchen, standing near the window where she'd clearly watched the exchange in the yard. She looked at the folded paper in his hand. Who was that? She said. Vernon Slade. He owns the cattle operation north of here. About twice the size of mine. He set the paper on the table. He's claiming I owe him money on an old water right agreement. He wants to file on the ranch land if I don't pay within 30 days. Adeline looked at the paper. She picked it up and read it without being asked. He let her. When she finished, she set it down and said, the interest provision. He says it wasn't settled. Was it? Yes. But I don't know if I can prove it clearly enough. She looked at the paper once more. Then she looked at him. Do you still have the 1,882 agreement? The original? In my desk. Somewhere. Get it. She was already moving toward the table, pulling out a chair. And bring me your payment records from 1,882 and 1,883. Every record you have. He went to his desk. He dug through the back files, the papers he hadn't looked at in years. He found the original agreement and 4 receipts from 1,883 and brought them to the kitchen. Adeline spread them on the table. She looked at them, the way she looked at numbers carefully, methodically, her finger moving across the columns. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She looked at the papers. She looked at Silas. She looked at her daughter. Adeline, she said. Check the survey boundary notation in the agreement. Margaret's voice had changed slightly. Careful now. 3rd paragraph. Adeline looked up. Then she looked down at the paper and found the 3rd paragraph. She read it. Then she read it again. What is it? Silas said. Adeline set the paper down slowly. She looked at her mother. The water right agreement, she said. The water Slade claims rights to it specifies the creek section. She paused. It describes the creek section by boundary markers. Yes, my father surveyed this region, she said. I know his notations. The markers he used. Silas waited. If those boundary markers say what I think they say, Adeline said quietly, then Slade's claim on that creek section may not be based on land he actually had the right to sell you access to in the first place. She looked at him steadily, which would mean the entire agreement might be built on something that was never legally his to offer. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret said nothing. She'd already known, or suspected, because she'd pointed Adeline to that paragraph. I need to look at my father's survey records, Adeline said. The ones in the trunk. Go, Silas said. She went. He stood in the kitchen with the papers on the table and the notice from Vernon Slade and the particular cold feeling of a problem that had just gotten larger and more complicated and significantly more dangerous. Outside, the October wind moved through the grass. Cattle shifted in the pasture. The valley lay flat and wide under a sky that had gone the color of old pewter. Slade had 30 years on this land and money and men and patience. He'd been building something for a long time, piece by piece, agreement by agreement, and whatever he'd built it to hold. Silas was a single rancher with a broken water right notice, a woman he'd turned down, and the survey records of a dead man. He looked at the paper on the table. He thought about what Adeline had just said, not hypothetically, not cautiously, but with the particular certainty of someone who recognized a pattern because she'd grown up watching it assembled. He thought that Vernon Slade might have just made a serious miscalculation. He put the coffee on and waited for Adeline to come back with her father's papers. Adeline came back from the trunk with 3 leather cases and a bound-field notebook, and she set them on the kitchen table, the way you set something down when you know it matters, but don't yet know how much. The cases were worn at the corners, the leather darkened from years of handling. Brass clasps were stiff. She opened the largest one first, and inside were folded survey papers, each one marked in her father's handwriting, small, precise, kind of writing that came from a man who'd spent years making marks that had to mean exactly one thing and nothing else. Silas sat across from her. He didn't touch the papers. He waited. Adeline spread the first sheet carefully, the way you handled something that might tear. She found the index notations along the margin dates, commission numbers, location markers. Her finger moved down the list. He surveyed this valley in 1879, she said, and again in 1881 for a boundary dispute between 2 homestead claims. She paused. And in 1883. Silas looked up. 1883. The same year as your water right agreement with Slade. She found the 1883 folder and opened it. My father kept full field notes. Not just the final survey, documents the working notes too. Every marker, every bearing, every measurement. She spread the 1883 field notes on the table. They were dense columns of figures. Compass bearings recorded in degrees and minutes, sketched diagrams of creek bends and ridge lines, boundary stakes identified by number and material. Margaret had come to stand in the doorway. She didn't sit. She watched her daughter work. Adeline found the Blackstone Creek section on the 4th page of the notes. She put her finger on it and turned the paper so Silas could see. Here, she said. My father surveyed Blackstone Creek in June of 1883. He was commissioned to establish the water boundary between 2 adjacent properties. She looked at the figures. The survey establishes that Blackstone Creek crosses the Calder land grant boundary at a point approximately 40 yards north of the old cottonwood stand. Silas leaned forward. That's on my land. That's what the survey says. The creek crosses your boundary before it reaches the Slade property. She traced the line with her finger, which means any claim Slade made to sell you access to that section of Blackstone Creek in 1882 would have been a claim on water that was already running through your land before it ever got to his. The kitchen was quiet. He sold me access to my own water, Silas said. He may have. Or he did it knowing that a water right agreement written a certain way could later be used to claim rights over the creek, regardless of the original boundary. She looked at him steadily. Either he made a very ignorant mistake in 1882, or he made a very deliberate one. He didn't make ignorant mistakes, Silas said. Not Slade. Adeline nodded slowly. She'd expected that answer. Margaret spoke from the doorway. Adeline, the monument markers. Adeline looked at her mother. Then she looked back at the field notes and found the page her mother meant. My father recorded the physical survey monuments. He placed iron stakes, marked stones, a particular corner post. These are the markers that legally anchor the survey. She read the entry. He placed a marked iron monument at the north boundary of the Blackstone Creek crossing. It should still be there if nobody disturbed it. If it's still there, Silas said, and it matches the survey, then you have physical evidence that the creek boundary was established before Slade's agreement, before and independent of anything Slade claimed. She closed the field notebook carefully, but we'd have to find it. Silas looked at the papers. He thought about 40 yards north of the old cottonwood stand. He knew exactly where that was. He'd ridden past it hundreds of times. I can find it, he said. Not by yourself. Adeline met his eyes. I need to come. My father's notations use his own shorthand in places. I'm the only one who can read them accurately on the ground. He wanted to say no. He could see the argument forming. The weather was cold, the ground was rough, Slade's men might be watching the road. But looking at her face, at the particular set of her jaw that he'd come to understand meant she'd already won this argument in her own head, he decided not to waste either of their time. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early, fine. He started to gather the papers. She put her hand on them. I'll keep these, she said. I know how to organize them so we can find what we need quickly. He looked at her hand on the papers. He thought about the account ledger, about the folded note, with 3 precise explanations. All right, he said. He got up and left the kitchen to her. That night, Silas sat on the porch in the cold for a long time. The sky was clear, the October stars out in full, the kind of sky that made Wyoming feel both very large and very indifferent to whatever small problems were happening below it. He thought about Slade on the gray horse, delivering that notice with the comfortable smile of a man who'd done this before. He thought about the 1,882 agreement, which he'd signed during a drought year when he'd been 29 and less careful than he should have been, when Slade had presented it as a neighborly arrangement. He thought about the 5 years since, the way Slade had let the thing sit, unused, patient, waiting for the right moment to bring it out. Slade had been building toward this for a long time. Silas understood that now. He also understood that the survey records in Thomas Bellamy's leather case were the kind of thing Slade would not have planned for. You couldn't plan for a dead man's field notes arriving in a broken wagon in the middle of a fever. Some things just happened. He went inside and slept better than he'd expected to. In the morning, Adeline was already at the table when he came to the kitchen, the field notes open in front of her with a separate sheet of paper where she'd been making her own notations, a cleaner, organized summary of the markers and bearings they'd need to locate the monument. She'd been up for a while. He could tell by the coffee, which was already made and already half gone from the pot. He poured himself a cup and looked at her work over her shoulder. It was precise and clear, laid out in the same methodical way as everything she did. The bearing from the cottonwood stand is north-northeast, 14 degrees, she said, without looking up. The monument should be approximately 110 yards on that bearing, in elevated ground near the creek bank. I know the spot. He drank his coffee. There's a break in the willows there. The ground rises about 4 feet. She wrote that down. Any chance someone disturbed it? Slade's men or anyone else? I don't know. I've never had reason to look for it. We'll find out. Clem knocked on the back door before they left. He came in with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he had something to say that he hadn't quite figured out how to say. Roy was in town yesterday, Clem started. And Silas said, he heard Slade's been talking, saying you've got trespassers at the ranch, saying the situation is irregular. Clem glanced at Adeline briefly. Roy said Slade mentioned the notice he served. Said you'd be out of the valley inside 30 days. Adeline looked at the papers in front of her. She didn't react visibly, but Silas saw the small stillness that passed over her. Roy didn't say anything else? Silas said. He said Slade bought drinks for about 6 men at the saloon. The kind of buying that comes with expectations. Silas set his cup down. What kind of expectations? Clem's jaw worked. The kind where he expects to have friends who'll back his version of things if it comes to a dispute. Silence. Go check the south pasture fence, Silas said. Stay close to the ranch today. Clem went. Adeline had her coat on before Silas turned around. They rode north along the creek line in the cold morning. Their breath showed white. The grass along the bank was stiff with frost, and the creek itself ran low and very clear, the way it ran in cold weather when the seasonal flow was down. Adeline rode well. He'd noticed that before, but noticed it again. Now she kept pace with him on the unfamiliar terrain without pushing the horse or falling behind, adjusting to the ground naturally. She had her father's notebook in her coat pocket, and she checked it twice as they rode, reading bearings against the landscape. They didn't talk much on the way out. The land required attention in places the creek bank was uneven, and there were boggy spots that the frost had made deceptive, solid-looking on top but soft underneath. Silas knew where to cut wide. Adeline followed his line. They reached the cottonwood stand-around mid-morning. The old trees were bare now. the last leaves gone, and the stand made a distinctive shape against the sky. 3 large trunks grown close together at the base, spreading wide above. Adeline got down and pulled the notebook out. She oriented herself with the creek bank and the trees, checked her written bearings, and pointed north-northeast. That way. 110 yards. They walked it. The ground rose as they moved away from the creek, a gradual lift over frost-hardened grass and scattered rocks. Silas counted paces. Adeline counted with him. At 105 paces, she stopped. Here. She looked at the ground. It should be within a few feet. They looked. The elevated bank was overgrown grass and low brush, some of it dead and matted from the season. Silas got down on one knee and started working through the ground cover with his hands, pulling the dead grass back in sections. Adeline worked beside him, moving methodically along the bank in the direction the bearing indicated. 3 minutes. 5. The cold was getting into his hands. Then Adeline said, "Here." She'd found an iron stake, driven deep into the soil, its top flush with the ground surface, and covered by several seasons of accumulated debris. She cleared the grass away from it with careful hands. The top of the stake was marked a stamped number and a cross-cut pattern that matched the notation in Thomas Bellamy's field notes exactly. Silas looked at it. He looked at the notebook Adeline was holding open. "That's it," she said. "Monument number 7, North Boundary Marker, Blackstone Creek Survey, June 1883. Her voice was steady, but he could hear something in it. "My father put this here." He looked at the small iron stake in the ground. 40 years of weather, and it was still there, right where a careful man had driven it. "We need to document this," he said. "I'll sketch the position. Exact measurements from the cottonwood trunks and from the creek bank." She was already getting out her paper. "Needs to be precise enough that nobody can argue about its location later." She worked for 20 minutes. He held the notebook for her while she paced out measurements, cross-referenced the bearings, and made a detailed sketch of the monument and its position relative to the surrounding landmarks. Her handwriting in the field was the same as at the kitchen table, small, clear, exact. When she was done, she stood and looked at the creek visible below them through the leafless willows. "The water flows through here," she said. "Right through this point, your land, before it reaches Slade's property. Before it reaches Slade's property." She folded the sketch and put it with the notebook. He knew this. He would have known when he wrote that agreement. Silas looked north, toward the invisible boundary of Slade's land beyond the creek's next bend. "He's been waiting for a dry year," Silas said slowly. "Or a bad year. A year when I'd be stretched thin enough that a $200 claim would be hard to fight." He thought about the drought year of 1882, about signing an agreement he'd thought was neighborly. "I gave him the opening, and he's been keeping it warm ever since." Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He didn't expect my father's survey to show up in your kitchen." "No, a beat. He didn't expect a lot of things." She looked at him. He was still looking north, and she studied his profile for a moment, the set of his jaw, the quietness of his expression, the way his eyes moved across the landscape with the particular attention of a man who knew this land by more than sight. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking we need to get this to the county land office before Slade makes any filings." He turned. "And I'm thinking we should go back now, before the temperature drops any further." They rode back without hurrying. The land was still and cold around them, the sky going flat white with the late morning overcast. Halfway back to the ranch, Adeline said, "My father came through this valley once. He mentioned it in a letter, said it was good land, well watered, that whoever settled it had chosen well." She paused. "I didn't know where it was specifically at the time." Silas didn't answer immediately. He thought about Thomas Bellamy, who had ridden through this valley 20 years ago and put iron stakes in the ground and gone home and written a letter to his family about good land. "He did good work," Silas said finally. "Yes," she said. "He did." The ranch appeared ahead of them, the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight up in the still air. It was a plain sight, nothing remarkable about it. A weathered house, a barn, a corral fence that still needed one more post replaced. But it was home in the way that plain things could be if they were yours. Silas unsaddled the horses while Adeline took the survey papers inside. He worked through the task with the same patience he brought to everything physical, and when the horses were settled, he stood in the barn doorway for a moment, just looking at the yard. He was still standing there when Roy appeared around the corner of the barn, faster than Roy usually moved. Boss, Roy's voice was tight. Creek's been dammed. Silas turned. What? North section. Clem rode the fence line like you said, and came back around by the upper creek crossing. Something went in upstream. Brush, rock, looks deliberate. The main channel's been partially blocked. Silas walked out of the barn. He looked north instinctively, though you couldn't see the creek from here. When? Clem thinks it was put in last night or early this morning. The ground's still freshly disturbed. Last night, while they'd been inside, planning, while Sli's men had been out working. How bad is the blockage? Clem said maybe 30–40% reduction in flow. Enough that the cattle will notice within 2 days if it stays in. Roy's voice dropped. The temperature drops and that blockage freezes solid, it'll be worse. Silas stood in the yard with the cold coming down and thought about 30 head of cattle and a 2-day window. Get Clem, he said. Bring the tools, we're going up to pull it out. Boss, if Slade's men put it in, then Slade's men can watch us pull it out. He was already moving toward the barn for his horse. It's my water. His people don't have the right to touch it. Adeline was in the doorway of the house. She'd heard or seen his face and understood from it. Damn, she said. Yes, Slade. Almost certainly. She came down off the porch. I'm coming. No, Silas. Not this time. He stopped and looked at her directly. This is going to be a confrontation, and I don't want you in the middle of it. Stay with your mother. She looked at him with the expression that said she had a counter-argument. He held her gaze. Please, he said. That was the word that stopped her. He didn't say please often, and she knew it. All right, she said, reluctantly. But if you're not back by dark, we'll be back before dark. He rode north with Clem and Roy. They found the blockage about a mile upstream, a deliberate construction of brush, large stones, and cut timber wedged across the creek at a natural narrowing point. It was well built, which meant it had been planned. Clem and Roy went at it with the tools while Silas sat his horse and watched the tree line on the opposite bank. The trees were still, no movement. Slade's men had done the work and left, which meant Slade wanted the message sent, not the confrontation had. Not yet. It took an hour to pull the blockage apart. The stones were heavy, and the frozen mud at the creek edge was treacherous. Clem went in up to his knee at one point and came out cursing and wet. Roy cut his hand on a piece of the timber. By the time the creek was running clear again, all three of them were cold and muddy and short-tempered. On the ride back, Roy said, he'll do it again. Probably, Silas said. We can't ride the creek line every day. I know. Then what do we do? Silas thought about the survey papers on the kitchen table. He thought about a land agent, about county filings, about 30 days running down. We end it, he said, before he has another chance to do this. That evening, after supper, Silas spread the survey papers on the table, and Adeline sat across from him, and they worked through everything. They had the original water right agreement, the payment records, Thomas Bellamy's 1,883 field notes, and Adeline's new documentation of the monument. Margaret sat nearby with her mending, not contributing to the conversation, but not leaving either. The land agent, Adeline said, there's one based in Cheyenne, but he makes circuit rides through the territory. When is he due in Pine Hollow? I don't know his schedule. We need to find out, and we need to file a counter notice with the county clerk before Slade files his claim. She had the original agreement in front of her, reading it again for the third time. There's another problem. What? The agreement is vague in one specific place, the boundary description for the water section. It says the east tributary of Blackstone Creek as currently flowing, which could be interpreted either way without the survey to anchor it. She looked up. The survey is what makes our argument solid. But the survey is only valid if we can establish that it was a legitimate territorial commission. It was a territorial commission, Margaret said from her chair, without looking up from her mending. Thomas was licensed. His commission records are in the leather case. I know, Mama, I'm saying we need to be able to prove that in a legal context, not just assert it. The commission seal is on every document, Margaret said. And the survey was filed with the territorial office in 1,883. It would be in their records. Silas looked at Margaret. She had known that. She'd known it and hadn't said it until now, which meant she'd been waiting to see how far the conversation went on its own. Territorial filing, he said. Thomas always filed. Margaret bit off a thread. He was particular about it. He said the fieldwork meant nothing if the record didn't exist. She finally looked up. The territorial office in Cheyenne would have a copy of everything he filed. That's a long ride, Silas said. Yes, Margaret agreed. It is. He looked at Adeline. If we send for the record, she started. We don't have time to send, he said. 30 days. And Slade just dammed the creek. He's accelerating. She was quiet for a moment. Then someone needs to go to Cheyenne. The table was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, running across the roof with a low sound. Not you, he said. Obviously not me. She looked at the paper. But someone who can identify the right documents and ask for the right records. Clem, he said. He's been to Cheyenne. He knows the city. Clem doesn't know what to look for in a survey filing. She was right. He knew she was right. Write it out, he said. Everything he needs to ask for. Every detail. Exact enough that someone with no survey knowledge can find the right record. She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her. She wrote for 15 minutes without stopping, precise and thorough, and then she read it back through once. Corrected 2 things and handed it to him. He read it. It was exactly what he would have wanted, and several things he wouldn't have thought of. I'll send Clem in the morning, he said. She nodded and went back to the papers. They worked for another hour. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking the way she moved the documents. The small line that appeared between her eyebrows when she was reading something she was uncertain about. The way she absently tucked a loose piece of hair back behind her ear and kept working. He looked away when she looked up. She caught him anyway. She didn't say anything about it. She looked at the paper in her hand and said, "The account books. The payment you made in 1,883, you have receipts. But is there any secondary record? A bank record? A merchant ledger? Anything that would corroborate the date and amount? There might be something at the Pine Hollow Bank. Old ledgers. Would they keep records that far back? I don't know, worth asking." He paused. I should go to town tomorrow anyway. Talk to the county clerk about the filing procedure. Don't file yet, she said. Not until we have the territorial record from Cheyenne. If you file without it, Slade's lawyer will pick the agreement apart on the boundary language before we can present the survey as counter-evidence. He looked at her. You know a lot about legal filings for someone who managed a surveyor's accounts. My father got into 2 boundary disputes in his career, she said. He lost the first one because he filed too early with incomplete evidence. He won the second one because he waited. A beat. He explained the difference to me afterward. In detail. He believed in explaining things. He sounds like a careful man. He was. She looked at the table for a moment. He was also sometimes maddening about it. He'd spend 3 days checking something that seemed obvious because he couldn't stand the possibility of being wrong. She picked up her pen. I used to argue with him about it. Were you right? Sometimes. A small pause. Less often than I thought at the time. They worked until the lamp needed refilling. Margaret had gone to bed an hour earlier. The house was quiet around them, the kind of late evening quiet that belonged to a house where people were settled. Silas refilled the lamp and came back to the table and found Adeline had gathered the papers into a careful stack, the most important documents on top, each one marked with a small folded corner so they could be found quickly. She was precise about everything. He'd noticed that from the start, the broth for her mother, the account books, the mending of a coat that she'd done without saying anything about it. He'd found the coat one morning hanging on the back of his chair, the worn seam at the collar repaired with small, even stitches that were considerably better than the original construction. He'd held the coat for a moment before putting it on. He hadn't said anything about it either. I want to ask you something, he said. She looked up. All right, why did your father keep all of this? The field notes, the working papers. Most surveyors just keep the final documents. She thought about it. He said the final document was just the conclusion. The field notes were the argument, and he didn't trust conclusions without arguments. She paused. He also said that people have a tendency to contest what a survey says long after the surveyor is gone, and when that happens, You need more than the final drawing. You need to be able to show your work. Silas was quiet for a moment. He was right about that, he said. I know. She stood and straightened her papers. I think he was right about most things. I'm still figuring out which things. She took her papers and went to her room. He sat at the table alone for a while. He thought about showing your work. He thought about a man who'd ridden through this valley 20 years ago and put iron stakes in the ground and written careful letters and taught his daughter to be exact. He thought about the way certain things arrived in your life without announcement and turned out to be the most important things you ever had. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. 2 mornings later, Silas rode into Pine Hollow for the first time since Slade's visit. He needed to see Harlan Webb at the county clerk's office and ask about filing procedure. He also needed to talk to the bank about the 1,883 ledgers. He went to the bank first. The bank manager, a thin man named Ostergaard, who had been at the Pine Hollow branch for as long as Silas could remember, listened to the request with the careful neutrality of a man trying to stay clear of other people's conflicts. 1,883 records, Ostergaard said. That's a long way back. I know, but I need to verify a payment. A large payment, $200, spring of 1,883. Ostergaard looked at him. Who was the recipient? Vernon Slade. Something moved across Ostergaard's face, carefully controlled. He was a professional, neutral man, and he controlled it. I'll need to check the archive, he said. The older records are in the cellar. Give me until afternoon. Silas said he'd come back. He went to the clerk's office next. Harlan Webb was a competent man who asked few unnecessary questions, which was one of the things that made him good at his job. Silas explained the situation, the 1,882 agreement, Slade's notice, the survey evidence he was building. Webb listened. He made notes. The key question, Webb said, is whether Slade files before you can present the counter-evidence. If he files the debt claim and the county accepts it, you'll be defending instead of presenting, and that changes the position. How long do I have before that becomes a problem? Depends on Slade's lawyer and how fast he wants to move. Webb tapped his pen on the desk. I can tell you that a territorial land agent named Hargrave is due through Pine Hollow in about 3 weeks. His circuit schedule has him here on the 22nd. 3 weeks. Clem could get to Cheyenne and back in 8 or 9 days if the roads held. Is Hargrave the right person to bring this to? He's the right authority. If the territorial survey record supports your position, Hargrave has the standing to rule on the water boundary question directly. That would make Slade's claim unenforceable without further litigation. And if we can't get the territorial record in time, Webb looked at him steadily. Then you'll be arguing without your best evidence, and Slade's lawyer will tie the boundary language into knots. He paused. Get the record. Silas came back to the bank at midday. Ostergaard met him in the small office off the main floor, a leather-bound ledger on the desk. May 14th, 1,883. Ostergaard said. He turned the ledger and pushed it across the desk. A payment of $212, drawn from the Calder account, paid to Vernon Slade. He pointed to the entry. Silas looked at it. The handwriting was old but clear. The amount was right. The date was right. I need a copy of this entry, he said. Ostergaard hesitated. Then he reached for paper and copied the entry out by hand, dated and signed it with his own name and the bank's account number. He pushed it across the desk. I'd rather not be involved in this, he said, quiet and direct. But I can't alter a ledger entry, and I can't pretend a record doesn't exist. I understand, Silas said. Thank you. He rode home with the bank copy in his coat pocket. He found Adeline at the corral fence when he got back. She was watching the horses, which was something she'd started doing in the past week, coming out to the corral in the afternoons and standing at the fence. She'd told him, once it helped her think. How'd it go? She said when he came up beside her. Webb confirmed the filing procedure. The land agent is due in 3 weeks. He handed her the bank copy. And the bank had the 1,883 ledger. She read the copy. Her expression stayed even, but he saw the breath she let out. This is the missing piece, she said. Payment confirmed. Date confirmed. Combined with the survey monument and the field notes. And the territorial record from Cheyenne. Yes, combined with all of it, she folded the copy. Slade's claim falls apart. If we can get it in front of Hargrave before Slade's lawyer files anything that changes the playing field. She turned and leaned her back against the fence rail, looking at the house. He stood beside her, both of them looking at the same plain building in the same flat light. He damned the creek because he's scared, she said, or because he's impatient. Same thing sometimes. She paused. He's a man who's used to controlling things by making people afraid of what he might do. When the threat isn't working, he has to start actually doing things. Doing things is riskier for him. She looked at Silas. The dam was a mistake. He put his hands on your property openly. He'll claim his men were doing routine creek maintenance. Let him try that in front of Hargrave with 3 witnesses and physical evidence of obstruction. She held his gaze. He's made mistakes. We need to not make any. He looked at her for a moment. At the cold air around her, the particular way she held herself straight, not rigid, the way of someone who'd learned to hold themselves steady as a habit. You're better at this than I am, he said. She looked a little surprised. At what? Strategy. Thinking 3 steps out, she shook her head. I'm not. I just know how to be afraid very quietly while I'm doing it, which sometimes looks like strategy from the outside. He said nothing to that. He thought it was honest in a way that most people didn't manage. Clem left this morning, she said. He'll make good time if the weather holds. The weather will hold, Silas said, though he had no particular basis for that claim. She glanced at him. You don't know that, no. But I needed to say something confident, and that was what came out. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, unexpected enough that it surprised both of them. She covered it with her hand. He hadn't heard her laugh before. Not like that. Come inside, she said. Supper's nearly ready. She pushed off the fence and walked toward the house. He watched her go, the way he watched things he was still figuring out. He followed her in. That same evening, north of the ranch line, a man rode hard to Slade's main house and came inside without being told to wait. Slade was at his own table, in his own kitchen, eating supper with the settled ease of a man in his own territory. They pulled the dam, the man said. Slade set his fork down. I expected that. They were at the creek line earlier in the day, too. Bellamy woman and Calder both, walking the upper bank near the cottonwood stand. Slade was very still for a moment. What were they doing at the cottonwood stand? Looking at the ground, the woman had papers. Slade was quiet. He picked his fork back up and ate a bite and set it down again. Send someone to find out what documents were in that wagon, he said. The women's wagon. Find out who the father was. Yes, sir. Tonight, Slade said. He went back to his supper, but he didn't taste the rest of it. He was thinking about Thomas Bellamy, a name he'd seen on a document once, a long time ago, and had chosen not to think about since. He was starting to think about it now. Clem came back from Cheyenne on the 8th day, which was a day faster than Silas had expected, and 2 days faster than Silas had privately feared. He rode in just before noon, his horse tired and his coat carrying the dust of a hard road, and he came straight to the house without stopping at the bunkhouse first, which told Silas the news was worth telling immediately. Adeline was at the table. Margaret was in the front room. Silas opened the back door before Clem knocked. I got it, Clem said. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, official paper with a territorial seal pressed into the top corner. Clerk at the land office found it in 20 minutes. Said Thomas Bellamy's filings were the most organized records they had from that period. He held it out. The clerk's certified copy, signed and sealed. Adeline took it from Clem's hand before Silas could reach for it. She unfolded it on the table and bent over it, reading fast. Silas looked at Clem. Anything else? The clerk mentioned one thing. Clem pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. He said someone else had been asking about the Bellamy survey records. About 2 weeks ago, a man he didn't know came in asking general questions about surveys filed in the Pine Hollow area. 1,880 to 1,885. The kitchen went quiet. Describe him, Silas said. Clerk said he was well dressed. Older. Didn't give a name. Silas looked at Adeline. She'd stopped reading and was looking at him. Slade sent someone to Cheyenne, she said. Before we even knew the survey existed, Silas said. He's known about it for a while. Her voice was flat and careful. He knew my father's name. He knew the survey was filed. He just didn't know where the field notes were, or whether anyone alive could read them. She looked back at the document. He sent someone to find out what was on file, probably to understand how much of a problem it was. And then we showed up. She straightened. The territorial record confirms everything. The 1,883 Survey Commission, the boundary establishment, the creek crossing location. It's all here, exactly as my father's field notes describe. She pressed her hand flat on the document. This is enough. Silas looked at the paper under her hand. He thought about Slade's man in the Cheyenne land office, asking general questions 2 weeks ago. He thought about the timing Slade had served the notice, and then immediately sent someone to check how strong the opposing evidence might be, which meant Slade already knew the survey existed. He'd factored it in, and he'd still served the notice. He thinks he can win even with the survey on record, Silas said. Adeline looked at him. Why would he think that? Because the survey is a territorial document, and he has a county agreement. Different jurisdictions. A good lawyer could argue they don't directly conflict, that the water right agreement was a private contract, regardless of the survey boundary. He thought it through. He'd say the boundary doesn't void a contract made in good faith. Adeline was quiet for a moment. That argument only works if the jury believes the contract was made in good faith. Yes. So we need to show it wasn't, she sat down. We need to show that Slade knew about the survey boundary when he wrote the agreement. That he wrote the agreement specifically to claim rights over water he knew wasn't legally his to sell access to. And how do we show that? She looked at the certified copy. She looked at the 1,882 agreement. She lined them up side by side on the table. The language, she said, after a moment. Look at the boundary description in the 1,882 agreement. The east tributary of Blackstone Creek as currently flowing. That phrase is currently flowing. It doesn't describe a fixed point. It describes a moving condition. She looked up. Most water agreements in this territory used a fixed survey monument reference because that's the standard language. Someone with knowledge of survey practice would know that. Slade knew that. He wrote it vague deliberately, so that regardless of where the survey established the boundary, he could argue the current flow gave him rights. She shook her head slightly. Smart, but it's also evidence of intent. You don't write that language by accident. Clem, who had been standing at the edge of the kitchen this whole time, said quietly, "So what do we do with all this?" Silas looked at Adeline. She looked at him. "We take it to Hargrave," she said. "All of it. The certified survey copy, the field notes, the bank payment record, the monument documentation." She paused. "And we do it publicly, in town when Hargrave arrives." "Why publicly?" Clem said. "Because Slade's power in this valley runs on people being afraid of him and not knowing exactly what he's done," she said. "This happens in a closed room with a lawyer and a land agent. Slade's lawyer buries it in procedure, and most people never know what the evidence actually showed. If it happens in front of the town," she stopped. "Different." Silas thought about Mrs. Walsh at the Mercantile. He thought about the men Slade had bought drinks for at the saloon. He thought about 6 weeks of watching this valley, run on the assumption that Vernon Slade was untouchable. "It's risky," he said. "Everything from here is risky." She was direct about it, not trying to make it easier than it was. But Slade has been managing this valley through private pressure. He decides what people know and when they know it. Public proceeding takes that away from him. "He'll come at you directly," Silas said. "If it's public, he won't let you put that evidence out there without fighting back. Let him fight back in front of the whole town." She held his gaze. "That's the point." He thought about it for a long moment. "Hargrave arrives on the 22nd, he said. "That's 11 days. Then we spend 11 days making sure we're ready." Clem looked between the two of them. Then he went to get coffee, which was what Clem did when he'd heard enough to know the decision was made. The next 11 days were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where you had things to do, but the thing that mattered most was still coming, and you couldn't rush it. Silas rode the creek line every morning. The blockage stayed clear. Either Slade had decided one dam was enough of a message, or he was conserving his moves for the proceeding. Either way, Silas didn't relax about it. Adeline organized the evidence with the same precision she brought to everything. She made a clean copy of the relevant sections of her father's field notes, cross-referenced with the certified territorial document, and wrote a summary of the factual chain that was clear enough for a layman to follow without being simplified to the point of losing accuracy. Silas read it twice and suggested 2 places where the sequence needed a clearer transition. She made the changes without argument, which was how he knew she agreed. Margaret, for her part, went through her own copies of Thomas Bellamy's commission records and found the original letter of appointment from the territorial government, dated June 1000, 883, naming Thomas Bellamy as the licensed surveyor for the Blackstone Creek Boundary Commission. It had his signature and the territorial seal. It established beyond argument that the survey was not informal or private work. It was an official territorial commission. She handed it to Adeline one evening without comment. Adeline looked at it for a long time. "You knew this was in there," she said. "I knew your father never threw away his appointment letters." Margaret sat down. "I didn't know if it would matter until I understood what you were trying to prove. Why didn't you say something sooner?" Margaret looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who had her reasons and wasn't particularly obligated to defend them. "I wanted to see how far you'd get on your own first." Adeline stared at her. "Mama, you did well," Margaret said, and picked up her mending. Adeline looked at the appointment letter. She looked at Silas, who had been watching from across the room. He didn't say anything, but she could see he was trying not to smile, which was almost worse. "Both of you," she said, and went back to her papers. The appointed letter went into the evidence stack. On the 15th day after Clem's return 4 days before Hargrave was due, Roy came in from town with a look that had trouble in it. "Slade's lawyer has been meeting with county officials," Roy said. "A man named Pruitt came up from the south. He's been at the clerk's office twice." Silas set down what he was doing. "Filing? Not yet. But Webb the clerk he sent word that Pruitt asked about the procedures for a contested land seizure. Specifically about whether a territorial survey document could supersede a county-recorded private agreement." Adeline, who had come to the doorway, said, "He's preparing arguments." "Yes," Roy said. "And there's something else." He paused. Pruitt went to see Mrs. Walsh and 2 other families near the south end of the valley. He was there a while at each place. The room was quiet. "He's building testimony," Adeline said. She said it flat, like a diagnosis. "He's going to argue that we're not legitimate parties to a land dispute, that we're opportunists who arrived and inserted ourselves into an existing legal matter for personal gain." She looked at Silas. "He's going to make the story about us, not about the agreement. Can he do that? He can try. Hargrave will have to rule on relevance." She was already moving back to the table, which means our summary needs to be even cleaner. Every fact in front of Hargrave needs to be undeniable before Pruitt has a chance to muddy the context. Silas looked at Roy. "Anything else?" Roy hesitated. "One more thing." Pruitt stopped at the livery. He was talking to some of the men there, saying, he stopped, looking uncomfortable. "Say it," Silas said. "Saying that the Bellamy women have been living at your ranch for going on 2 months. Saying that the whole survey argument is something they manufactured after the fact to protect a situation they'd already arranged for themselves." Roy's voice was steady, but he wasn't enjoying delivering it. He was saying it loud enough that a lot of people heard. Adeline stood perfectly still in the kitchen doorway. Silas looked at her. Her face had gone to the controlled expression, the one that cost her something to hold. "Adeline," he said. "I heard him," she said. "It doesn't change what I know what it doesn't change." She came back to the table and sat down and pulled the papers toward her. Her hands were steady. "He's doing what lawyers do when the facts aren't on their side. He's changing the question." She picked up her pen. "We're not going to let him change the question." She worked for 2 more hours without stopping. When she finally set the pen down, what she'd produced was a clear, tight, factual narrative, the 1,882 agreement, the 1,883 survey, the payment record, the creek boundary, the monument. No commentary, no emotion, just sequence and evidence, each point sourced to a specific document in the stack. She handed it to Silas. He read it standing at the counter. "Good," he said. "It needs to be better than good." She rubbed her eyes. It needs to be the kind of thing a man reads once and understands completely, because we may only get one chance to put it in front of Hargrave before Pruitt starts objecting. He looked at the document again. He thought about one chance. We also need people there, he said. She looked up. The other ranchers. The homesteaders along the creek. If they see this happen, if they're in the room when Hargrave rules. He set the papers down. Slade's position in this valley isn't just about what he files legally. It's about what people believe he can do. If they watch his claim collapse in front of a land agent, that's different than hearing about it secondhand. She was quiet for a moment. You want witnesses. I want the valley to see it. She thought about that. Then she said, there are 4 homestead families along the lower creek who've had water complaints for years. I heard about them from Webb when I asked about the filing procedure. I know their names, I know where they live. If Slade's water monopoly is what the survey evidence suggests it is. She paused. They have standing in this, too. Their access to Blackstone Creek would be affected by the same boundary ruling. He looked at her. He'd been thinking about those 4 families for the past week, trying to figure out how to bring them into a situation without making it more complicated than it already was. If they show up at the Hargrave proceeding with their own complaints, she said, it stops being a dispute between you and Slade and starts being a pattern. Yes, he said. A pattern is harder to argue away than a single case. I know. She looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at him directly. You should go see them. Not send a note. Go yourself and tell them what we have. He went the next morning. He rode to all 4 homesteads and sat with each family long enough to explain what the survey showed and what the water right argument meant and what a favorable ruling from Hargrave could mean for their access to the creek. He was not a man who talked easily. He said what needed saying and then stopped, which the homesteaders responded to better than if he'd tried to persuade them with more words. People who worked land for a living tended to trust plainness. 3 of the 4 families agreed to come to the proceeding. The 4th, a man named Cassidy, older, with a wariness about official things that Silas understood without agreeing with, said he'd think about it. Silas didn't push. He said he appreciated the time and rode on. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon to find Adeline on the porch. This was unusual. She didn't sit on the porch as a habit. She was almost always doing something. She had a letter in her hand. He got down from his horse and came to the porch steps. She held the letter out. It was addressed to her. The handwriting on the envelope was bold and deliberate. Came while you were gone, she said. Roy brought it from town. He looked at the letter without taking it. What does it say? She pulled it back and looked at it. It's from Pruitt, Slade's lawyer. She read from it in a voice that was careful and flat. He writes that he has become aware that I hold documents purportedly belonging to a Thomas Bellamy, previously employed as a licensed surveyor. He writes that the provenance and authenticity of these documents has not been established to legal satisfaction. He writes that presenting documents of uncertain origin in an official proceeding constitutes a significant legal risk for any party relying on them. She lowered the letter. He's threatening to challenge the document's authenticity. Can he do that? He can try. She folded the letter. The certified territorial copy has the land office seal. The appointment letter has the territorial government seal. The field notes are corroborated by the monument we documented on the ground. She was thinking out loud, running through it. He'd have to challenge the land office itself to argue the certified copy isn't authentic. That's not a challenge a lawyer makes lightly. But creates delay. If Hargrave has to pause to verify the document's origin before ruling, Slade gets more time. And more time means more opportunity for Pruitt to rework the argument. Silas looked at the folded letter in her hand. He sent that to intimidate you, he said. I know. Did it work? She looked at him. It made me angry. That's different. He took the porch step and sat on it, which put him slightly below her eye level. He looked out at the yard. The cattle were moving in the far pasture, slow afternoon movement, unhurried. There's one more thing we could do, he said. She waited. Drive the cattle into Pine Hollow the morning Hargrave arrives. He said it slowly, working it out as he said it. The strongest animals, visibly lean from 2 weeks of restricted water. Let the town see what a partially dammed creek does to a working herd before we walk into the proceeding. She stared at him. You want to make the argument before the argument. People understand cattle. They understand what a lean animal looks like in November when it should be putting on weight for winter. They understand what that means about water access. He looked at her. You said Slade controls the story. The cattle are a story anyone can read without a lawyer explaining it. She was quiet for a long moment. It also gives Pruitt less time to control the room, she said. If people are already talking about the cattle when Hargraves sits down. The question is already in the air. She looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, but not often the look of someone deciding whether to say a thing they were thinking. You're not just a rancher, she said. What does that mean? It means you're smarter about people than you let on. She said it plainly. You watch, you wait, and then you do the one thing that nobody expected. He looked at the pasture. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I didn't say you were perfect. I said you were smart about people. She sat down beside him on the porch step. Proximity was different from the kitchen, from the barn. There was less table between them, less task to anchor the moment. You drove 2 hours in the rain carrying a woman you didn't know because she was breathing wrong. That's not a calculation. That's just what you are. He didn't answer immediately. I had reasons, he said. I know you did. She was quiet. I know about your mother. He looked at her. Margaret told you. Margaret didn't have to. You told me, the night you sat with her and said, I won't, when she called out Thomas's name. She met his eyes. You weren't talking to her. You were talking to something else. He was quiet for a while. She was the same age, he said finally. My mother, when she got sick. Same gray in her hair. Same way of lying very still. He stopped. I didn't think about it while I was doing it. I thought about it after. Adeline looked at the yard. My father used to say that the best things people do are usually the things they do before they've had time to talk themselves out of it, she said. He thought about that. Your father sounds like he was worth knowing. He was. She folded the lawyer's letter and put it in her pocket. He would have liked this, the puzzle of it. The survey being the thing that breaks open, an agreement nobody questioned for 11 years. A pause. He liked being useful after the fact. His survey is being very useful after the fact. She almost smiled. He'd be pleased. They sat on the porch for a while in the cold without talking. It wasn't the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the other kind. The kind that happened between people who'd gotten to a place where they didn't have to fill every quiet. Eventually, Adeline stood. I'll write out the cattle plan, she said. Which animals, which road, what time? Roy needs to know the route. I'll tell Roy. Let me write it out. I'll tell you if something doesn't work in the sequence. She went inside. He stayed on the porch step another minute. He looked at the empty yard, the barn, the fence line, the big Wyoming sky going orange at the edge. He thought this might be what it felt like to have a partner. Not just help a partner. Someone who saw the angles you missed and said so without making you feel like you'd missed them. Someone who worked beside you without needing to be in front of you. He'd been alone here for a long time. The 22nd arrived cold and clear, the sky the brittle blue of a Wyoming November that couldn't decide whether to snow. Silas was up before 4. He dressed, drank coffee standing at the stove, and went to find Roy. They had a conversation about the cattle that Roy listened to without interrupting, which meant Roy already understood the logic. By first light, they were moving the herd. 22 animals, not all of his cattle, but the ones that showed the water shortage most clearly, the ones whose condition would be readable at 50 yards by anyone who'd ever wintered a herd. They moved them down the county road toward Pine Hollow at a slow walk, steady and deliberate. Adeline rode beside Silas. She'd asked the night before, and he hadn't refused. Margaret, who had also asked, had been refused. This had produced a conversation. Margaret had made her position clear. Silas had made his position clear. They had reached a compromise in which Margaret would come to town later in the morning in the smaller wagon with the survey documents, which she would deliver to Hargraves' proceeding with or without anyone's help. She'll be there before us, Adeline said as they rode. Probably. She moves faster when people tell her to take her time. I've noticed that. They reached the edge of Pine Hollow around 8 in the morning. The town was already stirring. It was a market day. People in from outlying areas, wagons along the main street. Cattle arrived like a fact. People stopped. Not because the cattle were dramatic. But because cattle coming down the main street of Pine Hollow on a market morning were unusual enough to make people look, and once they looked, they saw what the animals looked like, and the ranchers and farmers in the crowd understood what they were looking at. Roy and Clem moved the herd with practiced quiet. Silas rode at the back. Adeline rode beside him. Pete Garfield, who ran the feed store and had been in Pine Hollow longer than most, came off his porch and looked at the animals and then looked at Silas. "Those are Calder cattle," he said. "They are," Silas said. "Why are they lean?" "Creek's been running short. Someone put an obstruction upstream." He said it flat, the way he said things. "I pulled it out twice. It went back in." Garfield looked at the cattle. He looked at Silas. He went back onto his porch, but he kept watching. That was enough. Garfield would talk. Garfield talked to everyone. The county hall where Hargrave held his circuit proceedings was a plain building at the east end of the main street. By 9 o'clock it was full. Not jammed, but full in the way that told Silas the word had moved fast. The 3 Homestead families who'd agreed to come were there, near the back. Harlan Webb was at a table near the front. Hargrave himself was a compact man in his 50s, with the expression of someone who'd seen a great many people with a great many problems, and had learned to gather information before forming conclusions. Pruitt, Slade's lawyer, was already at the front of the room, arranged at a table with papers in neat stacks. He was smooth-looking city smooth, the kind of man who wore his certainty like a good coat. Slade was there too in the second row with 2 men behind him. He looked at Silas when Silas came in. The look was controlled and flat, the look of a man who had his pieces in position and believed he knew how the game would end. He looked at Adeline. His expression didn't change. He looked at Margaret, who came in behind Adeline carrying the document case. His expression changed then, barely, just a flicker of something recalculated. Silas saw it. He filed it. Hargrave called the proceeding to order. He explained that this was an inquiry, not a trial. He was gathering facts and testimony on a contested water right claim, and he would issue his determination within 3 days. Pruitt presented Slade's case first. He was practiced and efficient. He laid out the 1,882 agreement, the unpaid interest provision, the debt amount, and the land claim mechanism. He did it cleanly, without excess. He made it sound like a straightforward commercial dispute a man owed money who was simply using the legal mechanism available to collect it. Then he said, "The opposing argument relies on documents brought forward by 2 women who arrived at the Calder Ranch approximately 7 weeks ago under circumstances that warrant scrutiny." He didn't look at Adeline when he said it. Hargrave looked at him over his glasses. "What kind of scrutiny?" The documents in question purportedly belonged to a surveyor named Thomas Bellamy, the father of one of the women presently residing at Calder Ranch. The authenticity and chain of custody of these documents have not been established. Pruitt's voice stayed pleasant. Furthermore, the relationship between these women and Mr. Calder raises questions about the motivation behind presenting these particular documents at this particular time. Several people in the room shifted. Silas kept his face still. Adeline, sitting beside him, said nothing. Then Margaret stood up. Hargrave looked at her. "Ma'am, this isn't yet the time for." "I understand that," Margaret said. Her voice was the clear, carrying voice of a woman who'd spent her adult life making herself heard without shouting. "I'd like to be recognized when it is the time." Hargrave looked at her for a moment. Noted. "Sit down, please, ma'am." She sat. But she'd stood, and the room had looked at her, and that mattered. Silas presented next. He laid out the factual chain, the way Adeline had organized it, the original agreement, the payment record with the bank certification, the survey commission and certified territorial copy, the field notes, and the monument documentation. He put each document on Hargrave's table in sequence as he spoke. He was not eloquent. He didn't try to be. He said what happened in the order it happened, and let the documents be what they were. Hargrave read as Silas spoke. He was thorough about it, which was good. It meant he was taking it seriously. He held up the certified territorial copy and read the official notation at the bottom. He compared dates. He asked 2 questions, one about the monument documentation and one about the bank certification, and Silas answered both directly. Pruitt objected to the survey documents on provenance grounds. Hargrave looked at the territorial seal and the land office certification and said, "The Territory of Wyoming's land office certified this copy 4 weeks ago. Unless you're challenging the territorial land office's records, consular provenance is established." Pruitt adjusted his argument without breaking stride, which was the mark of a good lawyer. Then Hargrave said, "I'd like to hear from the woman who documented the survey monument." Pruitt started to object. Hargrave looked at him. Pruitt stopped. Adeline came forward and sat at the table across from Hargrave. She folded her hands on the surface, exactly the way she sat at the kitchen table when she was working. Hargrave asked her about her father's survey practice, about the field note notation system, about the monument documentation she'd conducted. She answered everything directly and specifically, citing measurements and bearings with the same precision she'd used in writing them down. Pruitt cross-questioned her. He was skilled, and he pushed on 2 points: her relationship with Calder and her personal stake in the outcome. She answered both calmly. "My relationship with Mr. Calder," she said, "is that he carried my mother out of a broken wagon in the rain when she was dying of fever. I don't know what you'd call that relationship, but it didn't require me to invent survey evidence to repay it." Several people in the room made sounds that weren't quite words. Hargrave tapped the table once. Then Pruitt did the thing Silas had been waiting for. He looked at the room, at the people who'd come in from outside town, and he said, "The fact remains that these documents were produced by individuals with a personal interest in the outcome, who arrived at this ranch under suspicious circumstances." "Mr. Pruitt," Hargrave's voice cut across him quietly, "you've made that argument. I've heard it. Move to your legal challenge of the survey's applicability to the water right agreement." Pruitt moved. His legal argument was the one Silas had anticipated: different jurisdictions, private contract versus territorial survey, good faith claim. It was a solid argument. Silas had known it would be. Then Hargrave said, "Bring the woman who holds the surveyor's commission records." Margaret came forward. She moved to the front of the room without hurrying, and she sat down across from Hargrave with the document case on the table in front of her, and she opened it. She took out her husband's appointment letter and set it on the table. She took out the commission seal and set it beside the letter. She took out 3 of Thomas Bellamy's filed survey reports from other commissions, each bearing the same seal and signature, each confirming the consistency of his work and notations across 20 years. She laid them out one by one. Then she looked at Hargrave. "Thomas Bellamy was a licensed surveyor for 23 years, she said. "He worked under territorial commission for 17 of those years. Every survey he filed is in your territorial record." She put her hand on the appointment letter. "This is his handwriting. This is his seal. I was married to him for 31 years. I can identify his work better than anyone in this room, including your land office clerk." She looked at Pruitt. "My husband put that iron stake in the ground in June of 1883, she said. "It is where he said it was. The water is on the land it belongs to. And the man in this room, who has been taking money from ranchers and farmers in this valley for access to water that was never legally his to sell, has been doing it for 11 years. Her voice stayed even. "I think that's worth knowing." The room was very quiet. Slade in the second row had gone still. Pruitt was already formulating. Silas could see it in his posture. He was about to say something about hearsay, about a widow's identification not constituting legal authentication. And then one of the homestead men in the back, a rancher named Aldous, who had a piece of property on the lower creek and had said almost nothing in 2 meetings with Silas, stood up. "My water's been short for 4 years, Aldous said. "Slade charged me a fee to access the lower channel 3 years ago. Said the water crossed his property and I needed his permission." He looked at Hargrave. "Is that what the survey says too? Or is my water mine?" Another man stood. Then the third homesteader. Hargrave raised his hand and the room held. He looked at the documents on his table. He looked at Slade. He looked at Margaret's hands still resting on her husband's papers. He said, "I'm going to need to review the territorial records and cross-reference the commission documentation. I'll issue my determination in writing within 3 days, as stated." He paused. "In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary hold on any further filings under the 1882 Water Right Agreement pending that review." Pruitt stood Mr. Hargrave. "That's not a ruling counselor." That's a procedural hold while I complete my review. You'll have the full determination in 3 days. He gathered the documents carefully. The room began to move. Slade stood. He straightened his coat. He looked across the room at Silas with the expression of a man who was recalculating and didn't want anyone to see him doing it. Then he looked at Adeline. She was looking back at him. She didn't look away. He turned and walked out with his 2 men behind him, and the room let him go, and then the room started talking. Outside, Silas found Adeline on the building step, her coat pulled around her against the cold. She was looking at the main street, at the cattle still visible at the end of it where Roy and Clem had settled them. Came and stood beside her. "Hargrave's going to rule for us," she said. "Probably. Not certainly. Nothing certain." He looked at the street. "But probably." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your cattle made an argument this morning that I couldn't have made with a year of paperwork. The paperwork made the argument that the cattle couldn't." She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing close enough that their breath made the same small cloud in the cold air. "Silas," she said, "I'd like to ask you something." He waited. She turned to face him fully, which took something. He could see it taking something. She wasn't afraid this time. What was in her face was different from the face she'd had at the corral, the desperate calculation, the crisis decision. This was something else, something slower and more considered and more certain. "Marry me," she said. The same words, different everything. He looked at her for a long moment, at the cold and the clear day and the street full of people and the cattle and the woman in front of him who had ridden into this valley in a broken wagon and had ended up changing the shape of it. He thought about what he'd said the first time. "You'll choose a husband because you're scared." He'd been right that first time. She wasn't scared now. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She hadn't been certain he'd say it. He could see that she'd been prepared to hear no again, had steeled herself for it. The yes landed on her differently than she'd expected. She looked away for a moment, at the street, at nothing specific. Then she looked back. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind them, the document case under her arm. She looked at their faces. She looked between them. She said nothing. She went down the steps and walked toward the wagon, and the small sound she made as she went might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else entirely. Silas and Adeline stood on the step in the cold for another minute. "Hargrave's determination comes in 3 days," she said. "It does. We should be ready for whatever it says." "We will be." She pulled her coat tighter. "I want to go check on the cattle. Roy has them. I know, I want to go anyway." He fell into step beside her. They walked down the street together in the November cold, toward the cattle and the waiting in the 3 days that would tell them what the valley was going to become. Hargrave's determination arrived on the 3rd day, as promised, delivered by a rider to the county clerk's office just after 9 in the morning. Harlan Webb sent Roy out to the ranch with it before noon. Silas was at the barn when Roy rode in. He took the sealed envelope without opening it and went inside. Adeline was at the table. Margaret was in the front room. He set the envelope on the table between them. Adeline looked at it. She looked at him. "Open it," she said. He opened it. He read it once without speaking. Then he set it on the table and pushed it toward her. She read it. He watched her face while she read, watched the careful stillness of it, the small movement at the corner of her mouth when she reached the ruling paragraph. She set it down. "He ruled for us," she said. "He ruled for us." The determination was 4 pages, dense with legal language and referenced statute, but the core of it was clear. The 1,883 Territorial Survey established the Blackstone Creek boundary prior to and independent of the 1,882 Water Right Agreement. Thomas Bellamy's commissioned survey was entered into the territorial record as controlling documentation. The boundary placed the relevant creek section within Calder land. Slade's agreement, written with deliberately vague boundary language that could not supersede an established territorial survey, was ruled unenforceable as a debt claim. The land seizure notice was voided. Furthermore, Hargrave's determination included a secondary finding that the water fees Slade had collected from 3 homestead properties along the lower creek, including Aldous, were collected without legal basis and required resolution through further proceedings. That last part was the one Silas hadn't expected. He'd fought for his own land. Hargrave had looked at the evidence and seen the whole valley. Margaret came to the doorway. She'd been listening from the front room. She looked at their faces and didn't ask the question. "It's done," Adeline told her. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment. She nodded once. The small, tight nod of someone who'd been holding something for a long time and was now, carefully, setting it down. "Good," she said. "Then someone should make coffee." She went to the stove. The news moved through Pine Hollow faster than Silas had expected, which meant faster than he'd thought possible. By evening, Garfield from the feed store had talked to Webb, who had talked to Aldous, who had talked to the other homesteaders. By the next morning, people who hadn't spoken to Silas Calder in months were stopping at his gate. He didn't go into town that first day. He had work to do on the ranch, and the cattle needed attention after the disruption of the drive, and he was not a man who needed to watch the effects of something he'd set in motion. He let it move without him. Adeline went to town. She went because she needed supplies and because she was not going to hide at the ranch while the valley absorbed what had happened, and because some part of her, the part that had heard Mrs. Walsh's voice in the mercantile 6 weeks earlier, needed to walk through that door again on her own terms. She went alone. Silas offered to come. She said no. She was gone 3 hours. When she came back, she put the supplies away methodically and didn't offer a full account of what had happened in town. She said people had been civil. She said Garfield had been more than civil. She said Mrs. Walsh had been at the mercantile and had not said anything, which was a different kind of statement entirely. "She look at you?" Silas asked. "She looked at the floor," Adeline said. He thought that was probably the most that could be expected. What he didn't know until Roy told him that evening was that Adeline, in the mercantile, had been approached by 2 women, younger women, wives of homesteaders from the lower valley who had introduced themselves and thanked her, who had said that their families had been paying Slade's water fees for 3 years and had been afraid to challenge it, and that what she and Silas and her mother had done had changed something they'd believed was fixed. Roy had heard this from Garfield, who had witnessed it. Silas thought about that while he was checking the fence line in the late afternoon. He thought about a woman who'd arrived in a broken wagon with nothing secured and who'd ended up changing something a whole valley had stopped believing could be changed. He thought about the specific kind of courage that didn't announce itself, that just kept working, kept being precise, kept putting one document next to another document until the argument was undeniable. He thought that he'd been alone on this ranch for 6 years and had managed everything adequately and had not until recently understood how much smaller adequately was than what was actually possible. On the 5th day after the determination, a group of men rode to the obstruction site on Blackstone Creek upstream of Silas's land. There were 9 of them, Aldous, 2 of the other homesteaders, 3 men from town who had their own reasons, and Roy and Clem representing the Calder Ranch. Silas rode with them. The obstruction was still in place. Slade had not removed it after the ruling, which was either defiance or the paralysis of a man who didn't know how to respond to losing. It took the 9 of them less than 2 hours. The creek cleared while they worked. The water finding its level, moving in the way, water moved when something blocking it was removed, not dramatic, just persistent, carving its way back through the channel with the patience of something that understood it had the advantage of time. When the last section of timber came out, the flow strengthened. The sound of it changed fuller, more present. Nobody cheered. These were working men, and they'd come to do a job, and they did it, and that was sufficient. Aldous said something about getting back before dark. Someone else said something about the temperature dropping. They packed up and rode back along the creek line in the long afternoon light. Silas stayed a few minutes after the others started moving. He looked at the water. He thought about the night he'd found the wagon in the rain. He thought about the arithmetic of small decisions, the decision to stop, to look under the canvas, to carry a stranger's weight through the dark. None of it had felt significant in the moment. It had just felt like what you did. He'd had no way to know that the woman he carried would have a daughter who could read survey notations, or that the survey notations would matter, or that a dead man's careful fieldwork would still be sitting in a leather case on the day it was most needed. You couldn't know those things in advance. You just made the decision that was in front of you and let the rest come out the way it came out. He rode home. Vernon Slade left the valley in February. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no confrontation, no final scene at a gate. He simply began selling off his cattle operation in pieces through the winter parcels of land, livestock, equipment, and by February he was gone. Pruitt had already left in December. What remained of Slade's water claim structure collapsed once Hargrave's determination had been filed with the territorial record. The homestead families filed their own complaints through the county, and the further proceedings Hargrave had referenced moved forward slowly through the winter months, the way legal things moved, without urgency but without stopping. Aldous got a partial reimbursement of the water fees. The other families got less, because the legal accounting of what Slade had collected was complicated and his assets were already dispersed by the time the proceedings concluded. Nobody got everything they were owed. That was the nature of it. You went up against a man like Slade, and you broke his hold on the valley, and that was the real outcome, and the money was an approximation of justice rather than justice itself. Adeline wrote a letter to her cousin in Millhaven explaining what had happened. She wrote it without apology and without drama, just the facts in sequence, the way she did everything. She said she would not be coming to Millhaven, that she had made different arrangements, that she hoped the cousin had found other help. The cousin wrote back after 3 weeks. The letter was brief and somewhat stiff and said she understood. Whether she actually understood was a separate question, but she said it, and that was enough. Silas and Adeline married in December, 5 weeks after Hargrave's determination. It was a small ceremony. There was no church involved. They went to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday morning, which was the day Webb was in, and the office was warm. Webb performed the civil ceremony himself, which he had the authority to do, and seemed genuinely pleased to exercise. Margaret was there. Roy and Clem were there, both of them wearing their good shirts and having made an effort with their hair. Garfield from the feed store came because he'd heard and wanted to, which nobody had thought to stop. Dr. Garrett came, which surprised Silas slightly, but Garrett said he'd followed this situation from the beginning and felt he had a legitimate interest in the outcome. It was not a smooth ceremony. Webb lost his place in the language twice. Clem dropped his hat at the wrong moment and swore quietly, and then looked mortified. Adeline wore her best dress, which was practical rather than bridal, and had done something different with her hair that made her look like herself, but more so, which was the best version of a thing. Silas said the words clearly and meant them entirely, which was the only way he knew how to say anything. Adeline said them back. Her voice was steady. Her hands, when he took them, were cold from the walk from the wagon, and she didn't try to warm them first, and he held them anyway. Afterward, Margaret produced a bottle of something from her coat that she said had been in the travel trunk since Cheyenne and was for a special occasion. Roy drank his with the expression of a man who had not expected to be moved by a Wednesday at the county clerk's office and was annoyed to discover he was. Garfield made a small speech that nobody had asked for, and that was 3 sentences too long, but genuinely warm. Garrett shook Silas's hand with a grip that said more than the words that went with it. They had dinner back at the ranch, the 6 of them around the kitchen table, and it was loud and imperfect, and at one point, Margaret said something about the venison that started an argument with Clem that lasted 20 minutes and was eventually resolved by Roy pointing out that the venison was already eaten, so the debate was theoretical, which settled nothing but made everyone laugh. Silas sat at the head of his table and looked at the people in his kitchen and thought about the 6 years before this, the long quiet of a house with only one person in it, the way silence accumulated differently when there was no one to break it. He hadn't known he'd missed it. You couldn't miss something you hadn't had. But sitting in the noise of it now, he understood what had been absent, and he filed that away somewhere permanent. The first spring after the wedding, Adeline made 3 changes to the ranch operation. She didn't announce them as changes. She made them the way she did everything, quietly, practically, and with a specificity that made the logic hard to argue with. The first was the account structure. She rebuilt the entire ledger system from scratch, with a running inventory, a seasonal expense projection, and a simple flag system for tracking what was paid and what was pending. Silas looked at the new system and said it would take him time to learn it. She said it was designed. so that a man with no patience for paperwork could still use it without losing money, which he took as a compliment. The second was the hay storage. She'd been watching the hay barn through the winter and had decided the current system of loose stacking was losing them 15% of the forage to rot and weather exposure. She worked out the numbers, presented them to Silas without preamble, and proposed a specific modification to the storage structure that required 2 weeks of work and a modest cost. He looked at her numbers, asked 2 questions, and told Roy to get the lumber. The third thing she changed was the kitchen garden. This was technically Margaret's domain. Margaret had started the kitchen garden in early spring with the aggressive energy of a woman who had spent the winter indoor bound and needed something to fight. By April, she had a 1/4-acre plot behind the house, producing more vegetables than any 3 people needed. By May, she was feeding every hungry traveler who came through the gate. This was not a policy anyone had established. It was just what Margaret did. A man would stop to water his horse, and Margaret would appear at the door and say the food was ready if he was hungry, and the man would come in because you did not decline Margaret Bellamy when she was holding a plate, and he would eat and leave and tell the next person he encountered that there was a ranch on the Blackstone Creek Road where the food was good and the welcome was genuine. By July, they were feeding people 3 or 4 times a week. Silas said nothing about this for 2 months. Then he mentioned it to Adeline, not as a complaint, but as an observation. "Your mother is running a hotel," he said. "My mother is feeding people," Adeline said. "She's done it her whole life. It's the thing that makes her feel most like herself." "It's not a problem," he said quickly. "I'm just noting it." "I know." She looked at him. "Does it bother you?" He thought about it honestly. "No. It makes the place feel different." "Different how?" "Like it belongs to more than just me." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that all right?" He looked at the kitchen window, beyond which Margaret was visible in the garden, inspecting something with her critical attention. He thought about a house that had been quiet for 6 years and was now rarely quiet. He thought about the specific weight of a house that had people in it who were alive to each other. "Yes," he said. "It's all right." Adeline reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment. She didn't say anything. She took her hand back and went to the stove to check on supper. That was how they were with each other. Not theatrical about it. Just present. They had disagreements, because people who worked closely together and were both particular about how things were done inevitably had disagreements. Adeline thought Silas was too slow to replace equipment that was past its useful life. Silas thought Adeline underestimated how much certain things could still be made to work with patience. They argued about this in specific terms, not general ones, which kept the arguments about the actual subject rather than about each other. She was right more often than he admitted. He was right sometimes in ways she didn't immediately see. They figured out over the first year how to tell the difference. He taught her to read terrain the way ranchers did, which grass meant the soil underneath was too wet, which hillside would catch the wind in winter, where the cattle would drift in a storm, and why. She taught him how to read a contract the way her father had taught her, not just the words, but the words that were missing, the spaces in the language where trouble lived. It was not a perfect arrangement because there was no such thing. There were mornings when one of them was too tired and said something too sharp and the other one felt it, and the kitchen was cold until someone apologized. There were decisions that had to be remade because the first version hadn't accounted for something one of them had known and the other hadn't. There were nights when the worry about the herd, or the weather, or the finances sat between them like a third person at the table. But they worked. They worked the way good tools, worked honestly without pretense, wearing down in the right places. 2 years after the wedding, Adeline found out she was carrying their first child. She told Silas on a Tuesday evening in the barn. She'd chosen the barn because she thought the kitchen was too ordinary a place for the information, and the bedroom felt too private, and the barn was where he was most himself. He was still for a moment after she told him. Then he turned and looked at her, and she could see on his face something she didn't see there, often something unguarded, something that hadn't had time to compose itself into quietness. "Are you all right?" he said. She almost laughed. "I'm the one who should be asking you that." "I'm asking you." She thought about it honestly. "Scared," she said, "and glad both at the same time." "That sounds right," he said. He came and put his arms around her. which was not something he did often, and which, for that reason, meant something particular when he did. She stood in the barn in the circle of him and looked at the horses in their stalls and the hay and the rough wood walls and thought about how unlikely all of it was. The wagon in the rain, the fever, the survey stake in the frozen ground, all the small specific things that had to be exactly as they were for this moment to exist. She didn't say any of that. She just stood there. "Margaret will be insufferable," she said finally. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "She's going to start building things. She's going to tell me everything I'm doing wrong. You'll tell her she's overstepping. She won't stop." "No," he agreed. "She won't." They stood there another minute. Outside, the November wind ran across the roof with its low, familiar sound. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He let go of her, and they walked back to the house together. The light from the kitchen window was yellow and warm against the dark. Margaret knew before they said anything. They came through the door, and she looked at Adeline's face, and then at Silas' face, and set her mending down and said, "Sit down. I'll make tea, Mama. Sit down, Adeline." Adeline sat down. The child was born the following August, a boy they named Thomas after a man who had put iron stakes in frozen ground and written careful letters, and believed that conclusions were only trustworthy if you could show your work. He was a difficult birth, and afterward Adeline was pale and exhausted, in a way that frightened Silas more than anything had frightened him in years, including Vernon Slade and broken water agreements and the ride through the October rain. Dr. Garrett was there and was competent and calm, and told Silas, afterward, standing in the hall, that she was going to be fine, and that the difficulty was not uncommon, and that she needed rest. Silas stood in the hall after Garrett left and put one hand on the wall and stood there for a while. Margaret came out of the room and found him there. "She's sleeping," Margaret said. "Is she?" "She's fine. Strong." Margaret looked at him with the directness she brought to everything. She was always going to be fine. "She's not a woman who gives up on things." "I know that." "Then stop looking like that." Her voice was not unkind. "Go see your son." He went into the room. Adeline was asleep deeply, with the absolute surrender of exhaustion. In the crook of her arm was a small, emphatically unhappy-looking person who had apparently arrived with opinions about everything. Silas sat in the chair by the bed and looked at his son for a long time. He thought about what it meant to be responsible for a life that hadn't existed before. He thought about all the ways a man could fail at it. He thought about the things his own father had said and done that had helped him, and the things that had left gaps he'd spent years trying to account for. He wasn't going to be a perfect father. He knew that clearly. He was too quiet sometimes, too reluctant to explain himself, too likely to solve problems by going out to the barn instead of sitting with the difficulty. Those things didn't disappear because he wanted to be better. But he would be present. He would tell the boy what was true. He would hold the things he said and did up to the same standard he held everything else honestly, without pretense. That was what he had. He intended to give it entirely. The boy grew, and then a girl came 3 years later, and then another boy 2 years after that. And the house that had been silent for 6 years became the house where nobody was ever quite sure where the noise was coming from, but there was always some. The surveyor's map hung above the fireplace, where Adeline had put it in the first winter Thomas Bellamy's original field map of the Blackstone Creek Valley, framed in plain wood, the notations clear in her father's careful hand. People who came to the house asked about it sometimes, and Adeline would explain it, and some of them understood the significance immediately, and some of them nodded politely, and either way the map stayed. Beside it, on a small wooden shelf, sat a dented tin cup. It was Silas's, the one he'd used through the 5 nights of Margaret's fever, carrying water back and forth between the kitchen and the spare room, setting it on the floor beside the chair where he sat, and changed cold cloths, and waited for a woman he didn't know to keep breathing. Adeline had found it in the back of the kitchen cupboard and put it on the shelf without saying anything. He'd noticed it there and hadn't moved it. They didn't need to discuss what it meant. Years later, many years, enough that the children were mostly grown, and Margaret's garden had become a permanent landmark that travelers mentioned to each other. By name, Adeline sat on the porch one evening, watching the valley in the way she'd come to watch it, with the particular familiarity of someone who understood a place at all its angles. Silas came and sat beside her. He was older. They both were, and the years had settled on them, in different ways more weight on his shoulders from the work, more still on her face from the thinking. They sat for a while. "I've been remembering the night you said no," she said. He looked at her. The first time. At the corral. She was quiet for a moment. "I was so angry. Not just embarrassed. Genuinely angry. I know you were. I thought you were being," she stopped. "I thought it was a kind of arrogance, that you thought you knew better than I did what I wanted. Maybe it was a little bit. Maybe." She looked at the valley. "But you were also right. He didn't say anything to that. I asked you the second time, because I wanted to," she said. "Not because I had nowhere else to go. Not because the math worked out." She turned and looked at him. "I asked because it was the choice I would make again if I had to start over." He met her eyes. They had the same quality they'd always had, that directness, that willingness to say the true thing rather than the comfortable thing. "I know," he said. "You knew then. I was hoping," he said. "That's not quite the same as knowing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she settled back against the porch post and looked at the valley again. This was what people didn't tell you about love. Not the finding of it, but the texture of it, long after the way it wasn't a feeling you carried so much as a practice you kept up. A choice you remade in small ways constantly, through disagreements about hay storage and decisions about when to replace equipment and mornings, when someone was too tired and said something too sharp. You chose it again every time. Not once at the corral on a cold day, but daily, ordinarily, without ceremony. That was the thing that lasted. Not the dramatic gesture or the moment of recognition, but the steady accretion of ordinary choosing, day by day, until what you'd built was so solid you could lean on it with your full weight. Adeline had first come to this valley with nothing guaranteed. She had believed, for a dark stretch of time, that her options had narrowed to a point: marry a stranger out of fear or face a road she couldn't navigate alone. She had been wrong on both counts, though she hadn't known that yet. What she'd actually had was her father's careful field notes in a leather case, a mother who knew her husband's handwriting better than anyone alive, and her own particular way of working through a problem, precisely, methodically, and without stopping until the evidence was undeniable. Those were not nothing. They had never been nothing. She'd believed they were, for a while. That was the part she'd had to unlearn. Silas had opened a door in the rain to two strangers and had asked for nothing, which was the kind of thing that sounded simple and was actually one of the hardest things a person could do. He'd done it because his mother had died on a Tuesday in March while help was still on the road, and because some part of him had decided, sometime in the years since, that he was not going to be the person who arrived too late if he could help it. That decision had cost him nothing he valued and had given him everything he had. The valley was quiet in the evening light, the creek audible from the porch when the wind was right, the sound of it steady and unchanged, running as it had always run across the land it belonged to. The children's voices came from inside the house, some small dispute about something, and then Margaret's voice cutting through it with the particular authority she'd been exercising on people for 70 years and showed no sign of relinquishing. Adeline smiled at the sound of it. Silas looked at his wife's face in the evening light and thought about the rain, and the wagon, and the woman who had said, "I need to get her somewhere warm," and the 4 miles through the dark. He thought about all the things that had come from 1 hour of rain and 1 broken wheel and 1 decision made without calculation. He thought that there were people who moved through the world waiting for the moment that would define them, the clear, bright instant of obvious choice. He'd learned, over time, that it almost never worked that way. The defining moments were usually the ordinary ones: the decision to stop when you could have ridden past, to sit in a chair through a long night, to say no when yes would have been easier, to say yes when no would have been safer. You lived by those decisions. You didn't always know you were making them when you made them. He put his arm around Adeline's shoulders. She leaned into it without comment, the way you leaned into something you trusted to hold. The light went out of the valley slowly, the way it did in Wyoming, the horizon holding the last of it longer than seemed possible, a thin line of brightness at the edge of all that dark. Inside, Margaret's voice had settled the dispute, which meant the children were now complaining about Margaret, which would shortly resolve into someone asking her a question because she knew the answer to most things and everyone knew it. Creek ran. The cattle settled in the far pasture. The map hung above the fireplace, Thomas Bellamy's marks, still clear after all the years, showing where the water was and whose land it crossed, and all the invisible truths that careful people had taken the trouble to record. The tin cup sat on its shelf. The door that had opened in the rain stayed open.